Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and today we're going to be ranking every single unit from Total War 3 Kingdoms, including units added from all 6 DLCs, for a grand total of 208 units. And as someone with over 3,000 hours in the game, I can definitively say this will be the most comprehensive campaign-focused unit tier list ever made. And with so many units to cover, this will naturally be a lengthy endeavor, even as I try my best to be concise and straight to the point. So sit tight and let's get things started with the 5 Militia Units. Available for recruit by all Han and Jin faction generals, the 5 Militia Units make for a good baseline for the rest of our tier list, and that is why we're starting here. Looking at the Saber Militia, we have one of the cheapest melee infantry in the game, with only 120 upkeep costs, and being a purple unit means that they naturally have high evasion and excel at killing other infantry units. Armed with a shield, the Saber Militia offers decent range block chance to counter range units, but have the fatal flaw of being weak against cavalry, and therefore worthy of being ranked in the C tier. D Militia, on the other hand, has a high weapon damage when compared to the Saber Militia, on top of a hidden anti-cavalry bonus damage, as green units typically implies that they are polearm units specializing in killing cavalry. However, with a slower attack speed, pitifully low evasion, and no shield, the D Militia will lose to every other type of unit, and even when facing off against their ideal cavalry target, the D Militia will struggle with catching them on foot, as they will not be able to dictate the term of the battle. Oftentimes, even a well-placed brace unit of D Militia will take heavy casualties themselves when struck by a head-on charge, as the best outcome you can hope for is most likely a 1-for-1 trade. Therefore, I rate D Militia as F tier, or trash tier unit, that really shouldn't be recruited. Moving on, we have the Archer Militia, which has the worst bow in the game, with only 180 range, minimum damage, and terrible accuracy. While they are extremely cheap and can use fire arrows with the right generals, their overall poor stats and weak bow makes them an F tier unit for me as well. Then we have 2 Cavalry Militia unit in the Mounted Lancer Militia and the Mounted Saber Militia, which are both strong units, as Total War 3 Kingdom features some of the strongest cavalry unit in the franchise, but we do need to know what these 2 units are specialized for, as they have very different uses on the battlefield. The Mounted Lancer Militia is your fast, high charge damage cavalry unit that is a bit fragile in terms of its defensive stats and its morale. It should be used as a flanking unit targeting the enemy's range backlines, and as a pursuit unit targeting wavering or routed enemy units for easy kills. It should not be used to charge your enemy head-on or be tangled up in long engagement, as you want to use your high speed and high charge bonus to your advantage. On the other hand, the Mounted Saber Militia is going to be an anti-range cavalry unit, specializing in tanking the enemy's range units to waste their ammo. With a natural trait that gives them 50% missile resistance, which is available on all yellow melee cavalry, and a range block chance of 65%, these units will only take 17.5% effective damage from any enemy range unit. Furthermore, commander class generals can boost the range block chance of melee cavalry units by another 20%, which ultimately will give these units 85% range block chance, or effective 92.5% damage resistance against enemy range attacks. Aside from this specialized role as a range tank, the Mounted Saber Militia is going to be weaker than the Mounted Lancer Militia in almost every aspect, but given their specialized roles, I believe both militia cavalry units are deserving of the B tier rank, as even though they are militia tier units, both can be used well into the mid game, if not the late game as well. Now, with the militia unit baseline established, let's use the Saber Militia, which we ranked as C tier, to compare with the other Sentinel only melee infantry units in the game. Starting with the Axe Band, we have a more glass cannon offensive version of the Saber Militia. Sure, the Axe is great against unit with shield, but the loss of evasion balances that out. So given that these units are restricted to Sentinels only, while the Saber Militia is available to every class, I end up rating the Axe Band as F tier, as they are just more restricted versions of the Saber Militia with very similar roles. Next up, we have the Saber Infantry, which is an upgraded version of the Saber Militia. There is a notable level of stat improvements across the board for a 33% increase in upkeep costs, Aside from stat improvements, the greatest upgrade here is going to be access to some key formations such as Shield Wall, which completely changes how you would use these units as they now can gain up to 95% range block chance as well as charge negation. But the Saber Infantry is going to require a few reforms to unlock, so at the end of the day, it's still going to end up as a C tier in my book. Then we have the Saber Infantry alternative in the Dian Sword Guards, which in my opinion is not only worse, but also a much more expensive version of the Saber Infantry, with the one advantage being that the Dian Sword Guards require no reform. However, this advantage is not that important, as the reforms required for the Saber Infantry is also quite important for some key buildings, so it's basically a must-have in every campaign, and thus the Dian Sword Guards are just a straight-up garbage or F-tier unit. Lastly, we have the Jianma Jian Infantry, which is a DLC unit that is an anti-cavalry melee infantry. Unlike other purple units, it has no shields and a low evasion, which makes this unit extremely fragile. While the splash attack does give this unit a lot of damage, the slower attack speed negates a lot of the benefits. At the end of the day, the Jianma Jian Infantry is an interesting design that is trying to fill a role that is simply not what purple units are good at, which makes it sort of jack of all trades, but actually terrible at everything type of unit, and that's the reason why I'm going to end up rating it a F tier unit. Then moving on to champion units, we start out with the Peasant Band, which is a cheap, high damage Z militia replacement, but it has such a low morale, you really can't use it, so it falls to F tier as well. Now our next unit, the Spear Warriors, is going to fix a lot of that problem with a higher morale, the same weapon damage, higher charge, higher armor, as well as access to formations. The only problem holding them back is that it requires a reform that's not often taken in the early game, which is why they'll end up just as C tier. Then moving on, we have the D Infantry, which is going to be the direct upgrade from D Militia. It's going to have a slightly better weapon with the balanced attack, with the same 20 attack speed, slightly improved morale, pretty much the same charge bonus, and a better armor on top of that, access to reforms. The key problem about D Infantry is that it requires a pretty hard reform that's often not taken because you need to build a grain storage, which is almost never used in the game. And while it is cross-the-board stat improvements for 33% increase in upkeep, I still think this is also an F-tier unit, much like the D Militia, simply because you're never really going to pick up that reform, and without a shield, the weakness against range is hard to swallow. And that's going to bring us to the Spear Guards, which will fix a lot of that problem with a shield that has a 55% range block chance. It also has some key formations like Turtle. So despite its low damage, the fact that it has the Turtle formation, which boosts its range block chance over 100%, allowing it to tank towers in siege battles as well as being a decent front line in Spear Wall, gives it a B tier in my book, even though offensively speaking, this is quite a weak unit with very low damage. Now finally, we have two more champion units, and they're the heavy upgrades of the D Infantry and the Spear Guards. First, we have the heavy D Infantry, which requires one additional reform past the very difficult one we mentioned for the D Infantry, which already holds back its grading here. It's essentially paying a lot more extra for a slight improvement in morale and armor. There's no change to the weapon being used, and a very small improvement in charge bonus. So overall, this unit is still going to be F tier for me. While you do have better armor to kind of shore up the weakness against archers, as you can block most of its base damage, it's still not a great unit to field, and the Spear Guard, even the base version, is going to be a lot better off, and the reforms only get harder as you have to invest another 5 turns to unlocking this unit. For the heavy Spear Guards, the upgrade requirement here is that your champion must be rank 6, which is a little difficult to get to, but once you get there, it is a worthwhile investment, as you do get slight improvements in weapon damage, morale, evasion, your armor, as well as your range block chance. So at the end of the day, you are getting across the board stat improvements, but you are going to be paying for it, as there is quite a steep upkeep cost increase for these units, but the main thing that's going to hold them back is the rank 6 requirement on champions, which takes a bit of time to get to. So overall, I think the heavy Spear Guards is still going to be rank B tier for me, similar to the Spear Guards, just because of that. Now, moving on to the Strategist Units, we start off with the Archers, which is going to be your first serviceable range unit that you can recruit in the game, in my opinion. It has very poor melee stats, which is understandable, low morale, but it's also a very cheap upkeep unit. And you have the standard bow with 200 range, most of the damage being base. You have access to fire arrows, which is great, as this becomes sort of the minimum expectation of a range unit in the game, which is why it's going to end up in the C tier. Then for the crossbowmen, we have a unit that has the same melee stats as the archers. It doesn't have access to fire arrows. It has half the firing rate, it has half the ammo, but much more damage at an improved range. And this slight 20-point range advantage is going to be key, as it will allow you to shoot the enemy without them firing back when you're in a siege battle. So even though it's only a 20 range advantage, it's essentially infinite, as you get to free fire on enemy archers. And while you can't light things on fire and you can't have as much of a morale impact, the sheer amount of armor piercing damage on the crossbow make up for all of this, as you might have half the ammo, but you're going to end up doing more than double the damage. And for the long run, even as you move into the mid and late game, as the enemy unit improve and have more armor, the crossbowman is going to keep pace with that, as your armor piercing damage is going to ignore all of that. And for those reasons, it's going to be a B tier unit for me. And then we have the repeating crossbowman, which if you look at on paper, it's the same melee unit with crossbow stats, but instead of doing high armor piercing damage, we're just doing 21 base damage, which is worse than archers at a slower firing rate with slightly less ammo than the crossbowmen and much more suppressed range of only 120. While all this is true, what you don't see from the repeating crossbowman stat card is that they fire multiple volleys per shot. So for your 12 ammo, each shot from that ammo count is going to produce more than 5 volleys of shot, as you have sort of this repeating shot effect. So instead of just doing 21 base damage, you're doing over 100 base damage at that range. And you're also doing suppression effects, which lowers the enemy charge bonus. So don't let the stat card fool you, as the repeating crossbowman is excellent against cavalry unit. It's just bad against other range unit. So at the end of the day, it's going to end up as a C tier unit for me. Now, much like the champion unit, the strategist unit will also have 2 heavy upgrades. We have the heavy crossbowman and the heavy repeating crossbowman. For the heavy crossbowman, you're paying a bit extra in upkeep cost for improvements in morale, improvement in health, as well as a huge improvement in armor. Slight improvement in your ammo count, but the bow is pretty much the same. Now, this ammo count increase is actually worth it in my opinion, as each shot represents more damage. So you're actually getting more damage here with this unit with improved morale, as well as slight improvement in per unit health. So this becomes one of the few heavy unit upgrades that I'm going to recommend, as I will rank the heavy crossbowman as a B tier unit, much like its crossbowman counterpart. Of course, you can choose to not upgrade, which is fine, as by the late game, your regular crossbowman at rank 10 is going to match the morale increase as well as the firing rate improvement. So it might not be worth it getting replacements, but if you're recruiting a new army, then going with heavy crossbowman is definitely a better choice. But on the heavy repeating crossbowman side of things, it's a lot different. You will get the same health improvement, same morale improvement, same armor improvement, but for the range aspect, you're getting nothing. So for almost a 50% increase in upkeep costs, you're not getting much here in terms of damage output, and you're not throwing these units in melee or in harm's way at all. So those upgrades you're paying for is not going to translate, which is why I'm going to rank the heavy repeating crossbowmen as F tier. Now moving on, we also have some mounted range units in the game, and they're going to be coming in the form of the mounted archers, the heavy mounted archers, and the mounted crossbowmen. And to save a little time, I'm going to be ranking all 3 of these as F tier unit, because essentially you're getting a unit that's not really a cavalry unit, since they have very low charge bonus and very weak melee stats, as they all use swords. But on top of that, you're also not getting great range unit. So whatever range stat you see down there, just keep in mind that there's going to be only 30 unit per retinue, so you're getting quarter size unit here, and whatever amount of crossbow damage or archer damage you can expect, you're only going to be doing 1/4 of that. So even with fire arrows here, you're going to have a hard time lighting enemy towers on fire because you just have less volume of arrow hitting the tower. And while you might think you have the mobility to kite enemies, if you divide their ammo count by 4 to match their unit size, you have much less ammo than a regular ranged unit, meaning that at the end of the day, when you run out of ammo, you have to use these as cavalry unit. They're just not going to hold up. So all 3 of these units will be F tier for me. Then moving on to the Vanguard units, we start things off with the Peasant Raiders, which is going to have a stronger weapon than the Mounted Lancer Militia. But for shock cavalry units, what's really important is going to be your morale, your charge bonus, and your speed. While the Peasant Raiders will match the Mounted Lancer Militia speed, it comes at a much lower armor value, which typically is what lowers your speed. So you're getting the same speed, but 13% less armor, and that makes the Peasant Raiders much weaker. The morale is also very low at just 20 points, and your charge bonus is only 2/3 of that of the Mounted Lancer Militia, making the Peasant Raiders just the F tier unit. Now, the Raider Cavalry is going to be a slightly different story, because while you still have less charge bonus, about 25% less, you have the improved weapon damage and the same defense as the Peasant Raiders for the same speed as the Mounted Lancer Militia. You have a unit that's going to be slightly better against other cavalry unit, thanks to the higher damage on its weapon. Since spear weapons also have a hidden anti-large bonus, so they're going to be doing extra damage to cavalry unit, and you have a decent morale of 30. So they're not going to be as versatile as the Mounted Lancer Militia, since those will be available for all classes of generals. The Raider Cavalry still has its purpose, and it will rank as a C tier unit. Then next up, we have the Lance Cavalry, which is the upgraded version of the Mounted Lancer Militia. It will have improved stats across the board for an increased cost. There is going to be a reform requirement that it's not too hard to get to, but sometimes you don't go for the red tree at all. Overall, the biggest issue I have with the Lance Cavalry is the fact that for the 12% extra armor that you're getting, you're losing 20 points of speed, which is actually quite massive, as speed for flanking and pursuing routed unit is still the main use of these units here. They're not heavy enough for frontal charges yet, so you're kind of stuck in that middle of nowhere tier with the Lance Cavalry, and overall I think that's going to put it as a F tier unit for me, as I would much rather stay with the Mounted Lancer Militia, with the only weakness being delegate value. Now, introduced in the 8 Princes DLC, we also have 2 other Vanguard unit in the Cataphract and Heavy Cataphract, and they require quite a few difficult reforms deep in the red reform tree. And we're going to treat them as a late game progression of the Mounted Lancer Militia into the Lance Cavalry, now into the Cataphract, and finally into the Heavy Cataphract. And very much like how you gain a bit of armor but lost a bit of speed on the Lance Cavalry upgrade, Cataphract's going to do the same thing. You're going to jump from 32% armor to 53% armor, better stats across the board, including improved weapon damage as well, and 25% range block chance for a huge decrease in speed from 75 to 58. So now the purpose of these units have completely changed. You're no longer the flanking threat or the pursuit unit. Now you're the heavy cavalry that's giving the frontal charge, and it's good at doing that with the formation of wedge or diamond, as the combination of the high armor as well as the range block chance can protect you from the incoming range fire. Then for the heavy cataphract, you do have a huge jump in price, but you're also seeing a big jump in charge bonus as well as morale, and even more armor for no penalty of speed. So you end up with a unit with more mass and better job at frontal charging than the regular cataphract. So this upgrade is actually a huge improvement in my opinion, as you're paying for the right stats that you want to use in combat, which is going to be that increased armor, increased mass without loss of speed. So the heavy cataphract is going to end up with the C tier, and the cataphract is going to end up with the F tier, as both of their reform requirements still a little bit steep, and the price is almost double compared to the militia unit, even though their role is now completely different. And finally, we're going to have the commander unit, which is just going to be a saber cavalry and a Gen sword guard cavalry. Very much like the infantry versions of these two units, the saber cavalry is going to be the better and cheaper option, but requires a reform. And the reform requirement is not that hard to get, so the saber cavalry is just going to win out in every aspect. But compared to the mounted saber militia, I don't think the upgrade here is significant enough, as you pretty much have an improved armor percentage here for tanking arrows, as the only reason we rated the mounted saber militia as a B tier because of its role as a cheap and effective unit at soaking up the enemy ammo from their range unit. Here, paying extra for a unit to just tank enemy arrows at a slightly better armor rate is just not worth it in my opinion. So the Saber Cavalry will get a C tier because it's better than the Gen Sword Guard Cavalry, which will get the F tier, as I just don't see a reason why we would have to upgrade from the Mounted Saber Militia to any of these two units here. And then moving on, we have the Siege unit in the game, and they are 3 across all the DLCs. We have the Trebuchet from the base game, the multi-bolt crossbow from 8 Princes DLC, and the Juggernaut from the Furious Wild DLC. Now, Siege units have many roles in the game, but the most important one is that they can initiate sieges in an open field battle. With a range advantage, it forces the AI action to march towards you, regardless of you being the defending side or the attacking side. But ultimately, the unit's great at taking down towers during sieges and walls, and that makes the Trebuchet the go-to choice, given that they all have the same price. And it really alters the game because it forces AI behavior that benefits the player to such a degree that the Trebuchet is going to get S tier. At the same time, the multi-bolt crossbow is specialized in killing infantry, but it's so constrained by terrain elevation that in my mind, it is always better to go with trebuchets when given the option. Certainly, there are flat maps where your multi-bolt crossbow is going to end up killing more unit, but the multi-bolt crossbow is completely useless in siege battles, and with the terrains working against you, it's not going to get as many kills as the trebuchet. So just make it easy on yourself and go with the trebuchet in all instances, as I'm going to rate the trebuchet as S tier and the multi-bolt crossbow as a F tier unit, because it just pales in comparison to the trebuchet in pretty much every instance in the game. Then the Juggernaut's a completely different story, as we don't have this super long-range siege weapon, but instead this very fun flamethrower that does insane damage. And this unit is so versatile and fun to play that even though there are some shortcomings in that it can get picked off by enemy generals as well as enemy range unit, and you do have to invest in protections against it, when used well in siege battles as well as open field battles, it can be simply devastating to enemy infantry, and for that reason, it's going to get S tier as well. Now that we're done with the class restricted units, we can move on to the dragon units in the game, and there are 5 of them, starting with the Pearl Dragon, which has one of the harder reform path of the dragon units. It's a solid all-around melee unit designed to whittle down the enemy forces slowly with its high evasion. It does have a key flaw in that it has low armor value, which means that it can trade down, as in lower tier enemy units can be just as effective against the Pearl Dragon as higher tier elite units that the enemy will field in the late game, which makes the Pearl Dragon kind of average in my opinion, so it's going to be a B tier unit for us. Then for the Azure Dragon, we have probably the shortest reform path of the 5 dragon unit, and it's pretty much like a Pearl Dragon, except it's a hybrid unit with good armor and equipped with a bow as a secondary weapon. And that makes it an A tier in my book, as this can be a solid all-around unit that you can utilize whether you're recruiting them on champions, strategists, or even sentinels, as you can get the benefit of the polearm charge reflect and the sentinel charge negation combination. Then for Onyx Dragon, we have sort of a long reform path, but a very useful one as you get early trade agreement as well as some key buildings by pursuing this reform path. It is the best range archer unit in the game, and something you can rely on starting in the early game if you go for this reform path right away. It also has decent melee capability, so after it fires away all its ammo, you can still rely on it for some melee damage, or if it gets hit by enemy cavalry, at least you can stand there and fight them off. So this is going to be an A tier unit for me as well. Then for Jade Dragon, it has a very difficult reform path because usually you don't go down the red tree. It hampers your economy so much that it's not advised. And even if you go through the trouble of unlocking this unit, I still think it's an average shot cavalry unit at best, with a low damage, low charge bonus for its price, as well as a heavy armor that weighs down on its speed. But if you like a defensive, tank-focused shot cavalry hybrid, it will get the job done. But all things considered, I think it's just a C tier unit, as you have a much better time going after the cataphracts as your go-to shot cavalry option in the late game. Then finally, we have the Yellow Dragon, which has the hardest reform path in the game, and I think is a unit that is rarely picked up because of it, and that's going to hold back on its grade. On paper, in terms of stats, it can be best summarized as a glass cannon offensive unit with turtle formation. The way to get value out of these units is to simply charge them head-on into the enemy, as they have an insane charge bonus for infantry unit. And when you're advancing against tower positions, you can rely on turtle. So they're still very flexible. It's just a very, very difficult reform path to unlock them. So for that reason, they're just going to rank B in our tier list here. Now, very similar to the Dragon unit reform path, we also have the Imperial unit, which I'm going to include the Protector of Heaven and Defender of Earth along with it, as those units become available once you hit the King rank. So let's take a look at the melee portion of these units before taking a look at the range. And starting things off, we have the Protectors of Heaven, which requires no reform. It just requires that you be of the King rank. And it's a solid unit all around. It's the best all around infantry unit in the game. You can spam this in the late game and win every campaign as long as you have the economy to support them. There's simply no weakness on these units. They're good against other infantry. They're good against enemy range. They're good against enemy cavalry. Just spam these and win the game. So naturally, they're going to be S tier. Then moving on to the Imperial Sword Guard, the requirement to unlock these are the same as the Pearl Dragon, which is a very hard reform path. But as a unit, it's going to be very strong. You have insanely high charge. You have access to shield wall formation, giving it effectively 95% range block chance. You also have access to turtle formation, which is not listed here, but you do have access to that. You have high evasion, high armor, on top of having a shield evasion and shield armor, which gives you even higher stats than the Protector of Heaven. That's not including the Imperial Solidarity, so having 2 Imperial units nearby will increase your damage as well as your defensive stats. And in terms of damage, it's not going to be as high as Protector of Heaven, but you still have a higher charge bonus on top of that, so it's going to be comparable. It's definitely a super strong top tier unit, but you do have to consider the fact that you have to get those reforms, you have to be in King rank, and you also have the Imperial penalty of 15% replenishment debuff. So all in all, it's only going to be an A tier unit. Then next up, we have the Imperial Gate Guard, which has the same reform requirement as the Azor Dragon. On paper, it's very similar to Protector of Heaven. You have slightly less attack damage, but slightly higher charge, higher evasion, same armor. And you also will have access to Imperial Solidarity, which will improve your stats. But at the same time, you will get the replenishment debuff. So it's still going to be an A tier unit. The reform path is a little bit easier here. It's much better to stick to Protector of Heaven, but if you want to spice things up, Imperial Gate Guard also works, especially if you're playing with a faction with high replenishment bonus. Then for the red unit, we have the Imperial Lancer Cavalry. The reform requirement is going to be the same as the Jade Dragon, which means it's very hard to get this unit. As the Shock Cavalry, it's much better than the Jade Dragon because we have top tier charge bonus, almost 400. It's the highest in the game on a cavalry unit. And to be honest, you have top tier stats for everything. The only weakness here is don't charge into Brace unit, whether they have charge reflect or charge negation, as that ruins your strongest strength. You're a little bit slow, so be careful to not get picked off by enemy range, especially crossbow unit that can shoot through your high armor value. The cost is obviously very high, both in terms of upkeep as well as reform requirements. So at the end of the day, it's just going to get a B tier rank. Last but not least, for our final Imperial melee unit, we have the Imperial Household Cavalry, which has the same reform requirement as the Yellow Dragon, which means you'll never see these units. It has very high morale, decent charge bonus, especially for melee cavalry. You have high armor, you have high missile block chance, which is key strength once again. But honestly, why spend 520 upkeep per turn for Arrow Sponge when you could be investing that money in just a simple militia unit to do the same thing? Actually better, because those units have 65% range block chance, even though you have much less armor. In terms of its use as a cavalry, it's not going to be comparable even to some of the medium tier shock cavalry unit. So it's just one of those worst of both worlds situations, even though it's still a solid unit across the board, and I'm still going to give it a C tier rank just because it's a strong top tier unit and definitely not trash tier. Then moving on to Imperial Range unit, we start with the Defenders of Earth, which requires you to be of the King rank, similar to Protector of Heaven, even though this unit has many weaknesses. It has quarter unit size for a range unit, which means you're doing quarter damage. It has very minimum range of 150. You're shooting a miniature bomb projectile that's considered oil arrow with splash damage, so you can do a lot of damage with these units, but they're weak against enemy range, which is a big problem. They're also vulnerable to enemy cavalry, and you end up with only 30 of them instead of the standard 120 for range unit, so they're going to be weak in that aspect as well. And even though they do have decent melee stat, once again, quarter unit size is going to hold them back. Their one strength is that they're great at lighting towers on fire in the rain, which is just a quality of life improvement for the cost and the fact that you need to be King rank to get these unit. I think these are actually F tier unit, despite the fact that they're Imperial unit. Then moving on to the Imperial Palace Crossbowmen, we have a unit with 250 range, which is the max range in the game, matches that of the Onyx Dragon, for a crossbow that has much more damage than the Onyx Dragon at a very high ammo count. These are the top of the line range unit in the game, simply the best that you can get. You don't have to look at their melee stats. You don't need their melee stat. With 32 ammo at such high damage, they will eliminate everything else. And because range units typically don't get hit in battle, the casualty punishment against these is negated. So this is an excellent unit to pick up. Definitely S tier in my book. Likewise, the Imperial Palace Cavalry is also very strong. Now, both of these units will get unlocked once you pick up the Onyx Dragon Reform Path, which is one of the earliest ones you should pick up. So, reform requirements not an issue for these. The one good thing about Imperial Palace Cavalry is that it's double unit size for a regular cavalry unit. So the punishment against ranged cavalry is much less on this unit, on top of the fact that it's a decent cavalry unit with at least over 100 charge bonus and very high health. And in terms of its arrow damage, it's not going to have the same powerful crossbow as the Imperial Palace Crossbowman with only 220 range instead of 250, and the damage is a little less, but still quite impressive. And because of the fact that it's mobile, I'm going to give it an A rank instead of the F tier rank that we gave to all three ranged cavalry units shown before. Now, with generic units out of the way for a moment, we're going to look at some faction unique units, starting with Lobe's E Archers and E Marksmen. So E Archers and E Marksmen have very high bow damage, 40 base, 10 armor piercing. It's the same bow that's used by Zor Dragons, so it's very high quality, 200 range, same as the Archer. And we have 28 ammo, which is on the high end for E Archers, and 30 ammo for the E Marksmen. In melee, these units are quite good as well, with high attack speed and a sword with 23 base damage and 8 armor piercing, high evasion. So they're going to be quite good in melee combat as well if you need them in a pinch, even though their health is going to be quite low as they are still considered a blue range unit. Additionally, they have the ability to fire while moving, which allowed them to sustain their DPS when relocating to the flank or to the side, or perhaps even chasing down some enemy unit. So overall, these are great archer unit. The E-Archers in particular have very high damage for their price of only 145 upkeep per turn, and that's going to put them as an A tier unit for me. The E-Marksman, on the other hand, jumps quite a bit in price, almost double, and you're really only getting a bit more extra armor, a bit more morale, while the range stat is staying pretty much the same with a small increase of 2 ammo count, and that's just not going to justify the price increase. So they're going to be F tier, stick with E-Archers, and ignore the E-Marksmen, which also requires a higher rank on your generals to recruit. Then moving on to Nobel's faction unique unit, we have the Infantry of Zin and the Imperial Defenders. Now the Infantry of Zin is going to be your Spear Guard replacement, as we'll have an improvement of stats across the board, including a better weapon that matches the heavy Spear Guard weapon, and you have extra evasion, extra morale, extra everything essentially. And it's going to function just like a Spear Guard for a little bit of extra cost, going to 200 upkeep per turn, which is well worth the price, as I believe the Infantry of Zin can actually outperform the heavy Spear Guard, which costs more than this unit. Then looking at the upgraded version, the Imperial Defenders at 265 cost, we're going to see a unit that has marginal improvement in terms of its morale, same weapon, slight improvement in terms of evasion, even though on paper you see the 6% increase on the base evasion, but there's 5% decrease on the shield because the tower shield seems to give less evasion. So overall, you're only getting a 1% boost, and that's just not very impressive given that you need a higher rank to get these units as well, and they're going to cost a bit more at 265 per turn. So I'm going to rank the Infantry of Zin as the A tier unit here, and the Imperial Defender as F tier again, as I will just avoid them entirely and stick with the Infantry of Zin for the entire campaign. Then moving on to Gongsun Zan's unique unit, we have the White Horse Raiders and the White Horse Fellows. So these two units are going to be much better versions of the Mounted Archer, as we're going to see charge bonuses that's going to be on par with Elite Shot Cavalry. And on top of that, we have bow damage that match the likes of Zor Dragon or E-Archers, which we ranked very highly before. The one weakness is we're still a cavalry unit, so we're going to have 1/4 unit size. So those ammo are really going to be divided by 4. So essentially we have around 11 to 12 ammo, depending on which unit we're talking about here. There is a very fast firing rate on these units, which is nice, and they can always fall back to being a decent pursuit cavalry unit once they have run out of ammo. So these are excellent units, both of them. And the upgrade design on these units are also excellent. As you see, the White Horse Fellow will get a different bow that has 250 range, the same bow that Onyx Dragon used. So you're actually paying for better range damage here, even though you're going to be a slower cavalry unit, as you have slight improvement in your armor. And the melee stats on these are fine, so I rate both of these units as A tier unit. They're excellent, you can rely on them for your entire campaign. If you want to roleplay as the Mongols, they're going to be your go-to choice here. Next up, we have Dongzhuo's faction unique unit, which includes the C-down cavalry and the heavy C-down cavalry. So if we look at the comparison, C-down cavalry is really a combination of the cataphract offensive abilities and the lance cavalry's defensive abilities. It pretty much have the same morale defensive stats as the lance cavalry, while maintaining the high charge bonus and offensive weapon of the cataphract. Now, to be honest, the C-down cavalry has way higher charge bonus than the cataphract for less cost, so it's actually a much better unit in my book, and it has much higher speed, even though it doesn't have as much armor. Then if we look at the heavy C-down cavalry, we are going to match the armor of the regular cataphract. We're going to lower our speed to 62, which is slightly higher than cataphract, but we're not getting that much of a bonus in terms of offensive capabilities, and we're paying about 50% extra for this increase of armor. In my opinion, that's simply not worth it. And on top of that, the heavy version is going to require a higher rank. So at the end of the day, the C-down cavalry is going to be an A tier unit for me with such high charge bonus, excellent weapon, and decent speed with the armor ratio. While the heavy C-down cavalry is going to fall to a C tier for me, it's not completely F tier because once again, heavy cavalry and light shot cavalry are used differently. For the heavy C-down cavalry, you can use it in a frontal charge, while the regular one is more for flanking and pursuit purposes. Up next, we have Cornell's faction unique units in the Fury of Beihai and the Thunder of Jian'an. These are top tier crossbow units in the game. If you look at damage, it matches those of the Imperial Palace crossbowmen with slightly slower attack rate and slightly less ammo, but it also costs much less, requires no reform requirement, and you get the Fury of Beihai right away. In terms of the upgrade between the two units, the Thunder of Jian'an gets slightly more per unit health, slightly more offensive stat in terms of charge bonus, and a little bit extra morale, a little bit extra evasion, basically a little bit extra stats across the board. You do get 2 extra ammo, which can be magnified with percentage increase on ammo count. Overall, both units are godly. Fury of Beihai, definitely S tier because you get them right away. Later on in the campaign, you could upgrade to Thunder Jian once your generals reach a certain rank. You don't have to, they'll delegate a little bit better. You get slightly more ammo, but it's too strong to be F tier. So Fury of Beihai, S tier, Thunder Jian, C tier. Now moving on, we have Tao Tian's faction unique unit, starting with the Territorial Spearmen, and this is actually a worse version of the Ji Militia, as you have less morale, slightly higher charge bonus, and the weapon's a little different as you have a spear instead of the Ji, and the damage composition favors more towards the base damage, so it's actually slightly worse against higher tier units. You're trading off 8 armor piercing damage for 12 base damage, so as long as the enemy have around 32% armor, you're breaking even essentially, and anything higher than that, you're doing a lot worse. It does have a defending bonus ability that will improve its attack and morale when on defense, but that's very passive and not something that you can control in the game. So these are not great units, and since the Ji Militia was rated F tier, I think the Territorial Spearmen at a higher cost is also going to be F tier as well. Then looking at the Territorial Archers, this is a slightly better unit. It has less armor than the standard archer, but it uses the same bow, and you end up with 5 extra ammo, which means higher damage potential, and your ability means you get extra bonus attack on defense, so outperform the archer in those battles. So it's at least on par with the archer, slightly better, and then can improve to even better when on the defending side for the same cost. So the Territorial Archer is going to end up being a C tier unit here. Then moving on to Yuan Shu, we have 2 faction unique unit in the Rapid Tiger Infantry and its upgraded version, the Warriors of the Left. And these are very juiced up melee infantry. Starting with the Rapid Tiger Infantry, we see a unit with very high stats. 42 morale is very high, matches those of the Tian Sword Guard, but you have much better charge bonus as well as a much stronger weapon that have the same attack speed. In terms of evasion, 52% is very high. It matches those with the shield of the Tian Sword Guard, slightly less, but about the same. You don't have to worry about getting countered by axes or having your shield point a different way when you get flanked. Armor is also very similar. The one major weakness being they don't have a shield. So you have to close that gap initially, but once you do, they are going to be pretty great. For 200 costs, I would say they're fairly priced, and they're going to be widely available to all your generals because they're going to be your faction unique unit. You can have these at the start of the game. and they pretty much beat every infantry in the early to mid game, so I'm going to give them a B tier for that. Then we have Warrior of the Left, which is their upgraded version. You can see improved stats and everything except for their weapon. You're upgrading for basically extra armor, since 52% evasion, 58% evasion, not that much of a difference, and then you're going up about 21% armor and about 16 points of morale. No additional benefit beyond that. For increased cost, that puts it more expensive than Pearl Dragon, and it's going to require higher rank on your generals. So those things hold it back, but still very solid melee infantry that will pretty much destroy any other melee infantry it fights against. So it's still going to be a C tier unit in my book. Then moving on to Sun Jian's faction unique unit, we have the Mercenary Archer, Mercenary Infantry, and Mercenary Cavalry. They require rank 1, 3, and 5 to be recruited, and they're all going to be S tier. Not because of their stats, but because they come with instant mustering. It kind of breaks the game because you have the unit available anytime within the turn that you recruit them. You can use a redeployment trick where you summon these units and then switch them to other units, and you pretty much start off with 85% of your health instead of starting out at 12%. It kind of changes the game in the late game, especially when you have Imperial Unit, as those will muster up so quickly with the use of Mercenary Units, and if they get injured, instead of having to wait for replenishment, you can just rinse and repeat, recruit a very cheap Mercenary Archer, and then switch them into Imperial Unit, and you have a unit that's at least close to 90% health right away. And they all come at rank 10, the Imperial Units, so you don't have to worry about re-recruiting them, whereas these Mercenary Units are going to be great throughout the game. And if we are going to look at the stats, the Mercenary Archer and Mercenary Cavalry are very good. Mercenary Archers have very high damage, the same bow that E-Archers have, you get them right away, and they have very high ammo count, so they're a solid unit. Mercenary Cavalry has very high charge, 274, and if you're playing as Sun Jian's faction, you're going to get Sun Ce, so that's going to double, and you end up with 550 charge bonus, which is just straight up insane. They do have a slight weakness in having lower morale, but that can be overlooked. Mercenary Infantry is kind of in between. They're not a great unit, but they're not terrible either. You can definitely use them in place of Saber Infantry. So overall, very strong roster unit for Sun Jian, all S tier. Then moving on to Ma Teng's faction, we actually have 6 faction unique units, starting with the Tiang Warriors. These are going to be very similar to Axeban. You have 2 axes and no shield, so very much a glass cannon version with higher charge and much better damage. And for that purpose, I think they're a better offensive unit, as that's what Axebans are designed for. So they're going to be C tier. You are going to be paying a bit more for them though. Then for Tiang Poarm, they are basically a glass cannon version of the Spear Warrior with the same charge, lower morale, which will hurt it, but you have faster speed on them, and they're going to be cheaper. So very much like the Spear Warrior, they're going to get a C rank as well. Then continue with Ma Teng's faction, we have the Tiang Archers, which are going to be slightly better versions of the regular archers. You have faster firing rate with 3 extra ammo essentially, and the melee portions very comparable. The upkeep cost is going to be a bit more, but I think given the improvement in the range aspect, it's going to be on par. Going to give it a C tier here as well. Then moving on to the cavalry unit, we start out with the Tiang Hunter, which is a bow hybrid with a glaive weapon. So as a cavalry unit, it's pretty decent with over 100 charge, and you have a good weapon on top of that with decent defensive stat that lowers your speed to 75. In terms of your bow damage, you have the same bow as the Onyx Dragon, which is just insanely good. You are still quarter unit size, so that's going to hold back against you, but you also have fatigue immunity. So overall, all things factored in, I think it's worthy of the A tier. Then in terms of melee cavalry, we start out with the Tiang Marauder, which is going to be the shot cavalry version. The closest comparison here will be the Lance Cavalry, but it's actually much better than that, as you have way higher charge bonus, slightly better morale, and definitely a better weapon. Defensively, very similar, slightly less armor, slightly more evasion, same speed, and of course, you have fatigue immunity. It is going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's well worth the charge bonus and fatigue immunity, so I think this is going to be A tier as well. And then looking at the Tiang Raiders, which is going to be your melee cavalry version, the comparison here would be the Saber Cavalry. You're going to have more charge as well. Pretty much all the Tiang Cavalry is going to have 50 more charge than its generic comparable unit, and it has very similar defensive stats. Weapons about the same for some, but you can see some faster attack rate, especially here on the Tiang Raiders. And in terms of defensive stats for arrow sponging, you have your 65%. So it's going to go up to 85 on commander, and then you still have the 50% missile resistance, so that functions the same. It's just overall a better unit. Sure, you're paying a lot more for it, but with fatigue immunity, it's actually better than you think, as once a unit gets fatigued, all your stats suffer. So in this case, you will never lose your core stats on any of the Tiang cavalry unit, and that makes them all pretty much A tier in my book, including the Tiang Raider here. Continue with some cavalry unit, we have Cao Cao's faction unique unit in the Tiger and Leopard Cavalry and the Heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry. And these are very interesting cavalry unit as they're more defensive in nature. And if you want to look at a comparable unit, the Jade Dragon is actually the best comp, as it also has a defensive shield and hold a short spear that deal the same damage. But aside from having the same weapon, you can see that Jade Dragon's going to have much higher defensive stats elsewhere, whereas the Tiger and Leopard is going to be sort of your medium cavalry. And then the Heavy Cavalry improves on that with better defensive stats, but you also lose more speed. So the key here for me is that while the Tiger and Leopard Cavalry has less attack damage on its weapon, it has higher charge bonus than even the Jade Dragon, which makes it a great unit at much cheaper cost. When you upgrade it into the heavy version, you don't gain any more damage, especially since the charge bonus only improves by 8 points, which is so low. But you do gain slightly more armor, but that's coming at the cost of losing your speed. So I don't think 19% armor is worth it, especially since you lose 3% evasion on top. So overall, I think the upgrade's terrible, but aside from that, the unit is fine. And thus, I think the Tiger and Leopard Cavalry should be A tier, and the Heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry should actually be F tier because the upgrade is so marginal. With the higher rank requirement, you're probably never going for these, especially since the armor upgrade and the mass upgrade here is only 19%, so it's not that significant of a jump. And it doesn't really match up to actual heavy cavalry unit like the Jade Dragon you see there with over 80% combined armor with the shield, whereas here you have barely 57%. So A tier for Tiger and Leopard Cavalry, and F tier for the Heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry. Then moving on to Yuan Shao's faction unique unit, we have the Warriors of Ye and the Defenders of Hebei. And starting with Warriors of Ye, we have a unit that's pretty much a D infantry, except you have way higher charge bonus and a slightly faster weapon. Everything else is very similar, slight increase in evasion, slight increase in morale, you're paying extra for it. And actually this price jump is pretty significant because you end up paying the heavy D infantry cost for the Warriors of Ye, which is slightly lower tier, but if you compare the stats, I would argue the Warriors of Ye will be slightly better. But in our base rank, the D infantry and the heavy D infantry were both F rank, and here I think the Warriors of Ye is also not as good. It has a key weakness in that it's terrible against range. So for that reason and its high price, I don't think it's a great unit. It doesn't beat melee infantry because of the low evasion. So even with the high charge, once the initial charge wears off, you're still going to be losing towards infantry. The only thing it really beats is cavalry, and there's better options against those. So here I think it's going to be F tier as well. Then looking at Defender of Hebei, you have a heavy version of the Warriors of Ye. You have more armor, you have more evasion, and you have more charge and way more morale. For another 50 increase in upkeep per turn, I think that price is actually well worth it. The increase in armor is significant because it shores up one of their weaknesses in anti-range. It also has higher evasion now, so it's better against other melee infantry, higher charge, and way higher morale. So these upgrade costs I think is well worth it and actually make Defenders of Hebei usable. So I would give them a C tier. Now moving away from the base game for a moment, we have the 8 Princes DLC unit, and there's only two. They're the Dull Sword Guard and the Dull Sword Guard Cavalry. These are replacements of the Jian Sword Guard. Dull means saber in Chinese, Jian means straight edge sword in Chinese. It sort of reflects the evolution of weaponry during this time period, but in reality, at least for the game purposes, I don't think it's that great of an upgrade. The Dull Sword Guard is pretty much the same as the Jian Sword Guard. It's a worse version of the Saber Infantry, which is still available in the 8 Princes DLC, and it's more cost for a unit that's worse. The damage is higher, but it has less charge bonus, it has less defensive stats for increased costs, and additionally 8 Princes exclusive units don't have access to Caltrap and Smokescreen, which is not a big deal, but still something holding back against them. I think this is still F tier unit. And for the Dull Sword Guard Cavalry, it's pretty much the same story. This is essentially a Jian Sword Guard Cavalry. It's worse than Saber Cavalry on all fronts, and it's also more expensive once again. The only thing that's slightly better, you can argue, is slightly higher weapon damage. But aside from that, all the key stats for cavalry in terms of charge bonus, morale here, everything is just worse. So essentially, I'm just going to rate both of the dull unit as F tier, as you should stick with the Saber variety for both the Three Kingdom time periods as well as the 8 Princes DLC. And continuing with 8 Princes faction unique unit, we have Sima Ai's Archer of Jing. So you technically have the Infantry of Jin as well, but since we covered it with Liu Bao's faction unique unit, we're not going to repeat ourselves here. As a matter of fact, you'll see a lot of the 8 Princes units are basically clones of base game unit. In this case, the Archers of Jing is pretty much the Archer. Very similar across the board, same weapon damage, same attack speed, slightly more ammo. The melee stats are going to be a little bit different as well. You lose a bit of morale, you gain a little bit of attack damage, you lose a little bit of evasion, you gain a little bit of armor. So all things considered, it's pretty much the same unit, but you're paying more for it. So because of that, it's going to be B tier. Then moving on to Sima Jiong, we have actually 2 pretty good units in the T Guardsman and the T Crossbowman. The T Guardsman's pretty much a heavy D infantry for pretty much the same price, and you don't need a reform requirement for it, and you have much higher evasion, so it's honestly a better unit, which is why it's going to get the C tier rank. And then for the T Crossbowman, it's pretty much a heavy crossbowman as you get the armor aspect, and in terms of damage, it's very similar. You have more ammo, actually significantly more ammo, and a slightly faster attack rate, essentially a 25% improvement. You're paying extra for it, but it's still a very solid unit, and what you're getting is well worth the price. So it's actually going to be an A tier unit, an improvement from the B rank of the heavy crossbowman. Moving on to Sima Liang, there is only one faction unique unit in the Imperial Guards. This unit was introduced before the Imperial Swords Guards were introduced in Mandate of Heaven. And in this case, it's a better version because it doesn't have the replenishment debuff that you suffer from Imperial Sword Guard. You don't have Imperial Solidarity, so there is no additional boost to the stat. But the core stat, as you can see, it's very comparable. The weapon damage is a little bit different. You're trading off a bit of armor piercing for a bit of base damage, but all things considered, I think it's pretty equal. You don't have the high charge, but everything is solid on this unit. You have high evasion, you have high armor, access to turtle formation, access to shield wall formation, versatile unit available for all your generals, and you don't need any reforms for that. So it's going to be an S tier unit. It's just top of the line that you can use right away. Then moving on to Sima Lun, we have the Xiongnu Cavalry and the Xiongnu Cataphract, and there's a lot of different comparables we can look at. For the Xiongnu Cavalry, we essentially have the Tiger and Leopard unit. We have almost the same stats across the board in terms of weapon, defense, speed, and we're paying pretty much the same costs. So that got an A rank. The Xiongnu Cavalry is going to get an A rank as well. Then for the Xiongnu Cataphract upgrade, you're pretty much getting the heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry, but you're paying way more costs. The price jump goes from 300 to 480, matching that of the heavy Cataphract, even though if you look at the stats, you're much closer to a heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry, and you're way overpaying for these upgrades. So this is going to be an F tier unit because the price value proposition just does not match up here, as you should just stick to the Xiongnu Cavalry for your campaign. Then moving on to Sima Wei, we have the True Infantry and the True Spearman. The True Infantry is very close to Warrior of the Left, both units with a lot of stats but no shield. Overall, not terrible, as the True Infantry is going to be a worse version of the Warrior of the Left, but you're also paying slightly less for it. Arguably, I think the stat loss is a little heavier than the price decrease, but it's still a solid unit, and it still beats a lot of melee infantry, so it's going to be C tier as well. And then for the True Spearman, it's pretty much a spear warrior with less charge and more armor, and thus slower speed. So that kind of defeats the purpose of the high charging spear warriors, and you're paying way more for the higher armor, which is useless against things like crossbow or higher tier infantry that has armor piercing damage, as you have very minimum evasion in melee combat. So the True Spearman is going to be an F tier unit. Then moving on to Sima Yong, we have the Xianbei Horse Archer and the Xianbei Riders. Looking at the Xianbei Horse Archer, it's pretty much a mounted archer clone, and that's not a good thing as we rated those F tier. There's really nothing good here on this unit. You're paying more for a unit that's arguably worse, as you have 5 point less morale. So this is just a terrible unit and is F tier straight up. And then for the Xianbei Riders, it's pretty similar. You're going to get a unit that's slightly better than the Lance Cavalry. You're looking at 14 point extra charge bonus, everything else being pretty similar, higher evasion, slightly higher morale, but you're also paying more for it. So that's also a pretty terrible proposition, and I would give this F tier as well, as you're better off sticking with mounted Lancer militias in this case. Then moving on to our final prince, we have Sima Yue, who has the Xu Raiders and the Warriors of Xu. And looking at the Shoe Raiders, it's pretty much an axe and shield infantry similar to mercenary infantry and axeman, and you can compare it to the default saber infantry as well. It has higher charge bonus, which is nice, a damage focused on armor piercing that match that of the mercenary infantry. Defensively speaking, it's going to be on the low end with even less defensive stat than axebans, but at least you get formations to make up for that. So essentially, this is more of a glass cannon offensive unit for a pretty decent price, as the key to getting value from this unit is to charge into your enemy repeatedly. So for that reason, I think it's good enough for a B tier. The Warriors of Shu, on the other hand, is a downgrade in my opinion. You're getting a decrease in your charge bonus and an increase in price. And the charge bonus was where you're getting the value from the Shu Raiders. Defensively speaking, you're moving up to the mercenary infantry tier, but you're not matching that of the saber infantry. So you're way overpaying for a unit that's more fragile with less charge bonus. So that's definitely a bad proposition. And thus the Warriors of Shu is a F tier unit. Then moving on with the Mandate of Heaven DLC, we have Noton's faction unique unit, which are Chen Royal Guard and the Chen Peacekeepers. Now the Chen Royal Guard is a hybrid between a heavy spear guard and a heavy crossbowman. The key here is that it's a blue unit, so in terms of unit health, it's going to be closer to the range infantry and only have 49k health. It's higher than the heavy crossbowman, but still pretty low compared to regular infantry, so while the combat stat is pretty high, you're not going to have that much per unit health. In terms of its range damage, you have the shield, which gives range block chance, giving you better trades against other range unit. But in terms of damage, you're pretty much a heavy crossbowman. There's not a lot of difference here. You don't have the top tier crossbow that the Fury of Beihai has or the Imperial crossbowmen have, so your range is only 220. But overall, this hybrid combination is very solid. You can run this unit and it can do pretty much everything you want it to do in the game and sort of spam this and win. You are paying a hefty price for it, so it's not going to be S tier, it's going to be just A tier. And then for the Chen Peacekeeper, what we have here is a melee cav that has a range hybrid. This is a better combination in my opinion because you end up with the stats of the melee cavalry with the missile resistance 50%, and you have a shield that has 60% range block chance on top of that, heavy armor across the board, bonus defense from the shield, decent charge bonus. The comparable here will be the Imperial Palace Cavalry, which uses the same bow. You don't have as much ammo because you are a melee cavalry first, but I think that's fine because your cavalry portion of the damage is quite high, including a very high damage sword, which is actually very impressive, and you have decent charge bonus, and you can kite enemies, encourage allies, just a solid unit all around, and definitely also worthy of an A rank here. Then moving on to the other faction in Mandate of Heaven, we have Lu Zhi, which has two unique units in the Defenders of the Empire and the Destroyers of Treachery. Now, Defenders of the Empire is pretty much a heavy spear guard that has Unbreakable. It is absolutely nuts that this unit exists as a defensive front line that will not break, as every unit will fight to the death. You essentially have a unit that looks like a spear guard, does not have the tower shield, but you end up with extra evasion because of that, as the tower shield has less evasion, and you have high armor, even better than the heavy spear guard. This unit price could double and it still be worth it, and that's why it's S tier. Then for the Destroyer of Treachery, it's a very interesting shot cavalry unit. It's considered a heavy unit because of the high armor and thus the slow speed. It has the same price as the Cataphract, and actually it looks very similar as a Cataphract. The charge bonus is also very similar, but you do have splash attack, so you're better at killing infantry. But aside from that, it's pretty much a clone of the Cataphract unit, and it's worthy of a B tier rank in my opinion. The splash attack really carries the day here as a good infantry killer. Then moving ahead to A World Betrayed, we have Sun Tzu's faction unique unit in the Tiger Guard and the Handmaid Guard. Both units are quite similar, but they're also very different. Both have the Guard passive, which helps your nearby generals take some damage resistance. But the Tiger Guard here is essentially a heavy spear guard as well. You have the increased damage, you have the same shield as a spear guard, but the stat wise, you're actually much closer to a heavy spear guard. Now the problem here is you're paying a lot more for this unit, and that's where it falls slightly short, as the guard passive on this unit is also hard to use because you're much slower than generals, so it's hard for you to keep pace with them as they fight ahead. But overall, still a very solid faction unique unit and worthy of the A tier. Then we have the Handmaid Guard, which is a pretty interesting unit. It's cheap, it's similar to a Dian Sword Guard unit, but it has some weakness as a melee cavalry. It's not good against missiles because you only have 20% range block chance than the 65% you expect. You're paying much less for this unit, but you're really only going to recruit maybe one of them for the guard passive. As a unit themselves, the lack of shield really weakens it. So it's not a great unit, but it has its uses. It's going to be just a C tier for me. Lastly, we have the Bulls Faction Unique unit from a World Betrayed DLC as well, in the Camp Crushers and the Flying Riders. The Camp Crushers is an improved version of the Zhaimadian infantry for a lot less cost. You have more charge, more morale, same damage, more evasion, and much more armor, thus shoring up a lot of the weaknesses against range as well as against other melee infantry that's suffered by the Zhaimadian infantry. But despite these improvements, I still think the Camp Crushers lack identity, as it's designed to fight cavalry units, and it's not really great at that because you can't catch up to them with such slow speed. You have to let them charge into you, be brace, have charge negation, and then fight them off. And against infantry, while the increased evasion armor is great, it still doesn't trade very well into more elite infantry in the late game, and it still suffers against crossbow, which ignores most of that armor, as it has no shield. So I think it's just going to get a C tier in my book. The Flying Rider is also a very interesting unit for Lu Bu because Lu Bu still have access to Sedan Cavalry. So looking at a comparison here, you have a unit that has much less charge than the heavy Sedan Cavalry, as this is really a heavy unit with 45% armor and only 62 speed. The regular Sedan Cavalry is actually going to outperform this unit by quite a lot. It also uses the D instead of the spear, so it actually has lower damage in my opinion against heavily armored opponents, but most of all, it just has a low charge bonus, is closer to a Cataphract for its price, with a worse weapon at a similar speed and armor trade-off level. It's just much better to go with the regular Sedan Cav, so for this unit, I think it's just F tier. Now, moving ahead to Fates Divided DLC, we have the introduction of Northern Units. Now, these are available to Cao Cao and Yuan Shao's factions. Once your faction leader reaches rank 7, you get 5 items called the Colonels of the Northern Army, and once you have them equipped on a character, you gain access to these units. Now, the issue here is that these units have a recruitment capacity, and it's dictated by how many of these items you have equipped, and these are bounded items, so at most you get 5 copies of each, so it is a little bit limited, and that's going to weigh on the grading of these units. And let's take a look at them, starting with the Northern Saber Infantry and the Northern Veteran Saber Infantry, which are basically Saber Infantry alternative and an upgraded version. So looking at the stats here, it's going to be pretty similar with the Northern Saber Infantry. You have pretty much the same stats across the board, and it's going to cost pretty much identical as well. And then for the upgraded Northern Veteran Saber Infantry, the key difference here, aside from improved defense and slight improvement in morale and charge bonus, is the access to turtle formation, which completely transforms this unit. And it's actually rather cheap for these upgrade, as you go from 168 for the regular Northern Saber Infantry to 180 for the Veteran Saber Infantry. So given the increase in stats, cheap costs, and access to turtle formation, the Northern Veteran Saber Infantry is going to be rated as A tier, while the Northern Saber Infantry is going to be an F tier unit because there's no reason to recruit them, as you can just settle for the Saber Infantry. They'll do the same thing at a cheaper cost, and without any restrictions on recruitment cap. Then moving on to the D Infantry variety, we have the Northern D Infantry and the Northern Veteran D Infantry. Once again, same thing with the item being equipped, same thing with the recruitment cap. And if we look at the comparison here, they're going to be pretty much identical to the regular D Infantry and the heavy D Infantry, which both didn't rate very highly. Add on top of the fact that these are going to be scarce and require you to bound an item to a unit, there's no reason to get these in my opinion, and both should be F tier, even though they are going to be cheaper and they don't require reform. So if you really wanted a shieldless spear unit in your army, perhaps these are the ones you want. But honestly, with only 5 such items, when you have them equipped on certain characters, these will not be your go-to unit from the Northern unit roster. What you might recruit instead is the Northern Spear Guards and the Northern Veteran Spears. So the Northern Spear Guard replaces the regular Spear Guard with a better weapon. It pretty much upgrades to the heavy Spear Guard weapon ahead of time. There is a slight loss of stats in terms of morale, but you make up for it by increasing your attack as well as increasing your evasion by a little bit. There's increased costs, but being scarce and restricted to 5 units for recruitment does hold these back. So I think these are just C tier, slightly below the B tier Spear Guard, even though they do have better damage. What you really want to recruit here are the Northern Veteran Spears. So what you essentially have here is an improved version of the Heavy Spear Guard at a much cheaper cost. You just have 5 of these to recruit, and you must have the items equipped. So that's pretty much what's holding it back. Aside from that, it's a pretty good unit. Going to rank it as B, similar to the Heavy Spear Guard, just holding it back a bit because you only get 5 and you have to get the item restricted to only 2 playable factions once you get the DLC. Continue with the Northern units, we also have 2 mounted cavalry archers, one called Northern Mounted Raiders, which I believe is Yuan Shao's unit, and then there's also the Northern Mounted Archer, which is the variety you get when playing as Cao Cao. These are the only 2 units that are different between the 2 factions from the Northern roster, and they're actually quite different in terms of what they bring. In terms of the range aspect, they have the same bow, same range, same attack speed, but for their cavalry stat, it's completely different. The Raiders have much higher charge bonus, 206, no defensive shield, whereas the Northern Mounted Archers have a 45% range block shield, but sacrifices almost 100 point in charge bonus, which I think is a big deal. It's using a short spear, same weapon as the Spear Guards, which is okay, but it's less damage than what the Northern Mounted Raiders are using. So overall, I think the Raiders are much better. It's also cheaper. So that's going to end up getting a B tier rank, while the Northern Mounted Archer really suffer from the same problem as regular mounted archers, as you have basic quarter unit size, so the range aspect is not that great. You actually have less ammo than the regular mounted archer. You do have slightly more charge bonus, but that's not enough to make up for it. I don't think you really need the shield. And that basically boils down to not wanting to recruit this unit when you only have 5 restrictions of the item on 5 generals, and you get 5 copies as well. So it's just not worth a slot, and that's why it's going to get F tier rank. Then moving ahead to Shock Cavalry unit, we have 2 in the Northern Lancer Cavalry and the Northern Veteran Lancers. Both are great unit at very cheap costs. They're both comparable to Lance Cavalry in terms of their damage. Looking at the Northern Lancer Cavalry, it's pretty much identical, slightly less charge, but you're paying much less price in terms of upkeep at only 196, which makes this a pretty decent unit. I would rate this a C. Northern Veteran Lancers, similarly, you're getting a heavy cavalry with decent charge at a reasonable speed for its armor. The only weakness of these units is they have slightly low morale, but aside from that, very cheap unit, very effective unit, and they both should be ranked as C. Then moving on to the final 2 unit from the Northern units, we have 2 melee cavalry in the Northern Saber Cavalry and Northern Veteran Saber Cavalry, both comparable to the Saber Cav. Now, to keep it concise, both units suffer from the same problem in that they only have 45% range block chance, so essentially you want to go with a mounted Saber Militia unit for the Arrow Sponge. They're not fast, they're not high charging like a Shock Cavalry, so if you're limited in what you can recruit, you would never pick these guys, and thus both will be F tier here. Then continue with the Fates Divided DLC factions. We have Douyan's faction unique unit in the Dongzhoubin Defenders and Dongzhoubin Marksmen. The Dongzhoubin Defenders is a hybrid unit that's a cross between a heavy spear guard and an archer. The range damage portion is decent. You have 15 ammo, which is not that low. The damage is identical to that of an archer. You get access to fire arrows, and poison arrow has the right skills. It has some formations, in particular the hollow square, which is pretty good against cavalry. On top of that, you have a decent heavy spear guard unit. You just don't have the turtle formation, but it's very versatile. It can fight off enemy infantry, it can fight off enemy cavalry, it can fight off enemy range unit, as you have a shield that has 60% range block chance when exchanging fire with enemy units. So this is pretty good. It's going to be B tier rank. It's pricey. There's going to be limitations on how many you can recruit, but that also depends on how you deal with the inheritance mechanic. So that varies a little bit. We're not going to count too heavily against that. Of course, you could screw up inheritance and end up with very few of these, but that's a totally different issue. Then for the Dongzhoubin Marksman, we have a very high power bow unit. You have the same bow damage of Azor Dragon. Now, the melee aspect is quite weak. It's similar to an archer, but you're getting quite a powerful range unit similar to E-Archers, and it's going to get a B rank as well. Cao Cao also picked up a few DLC unit here in the Fates Divided DLC, in particular the Qingzhou unit, the Qingzhou Halberd, and Qingzhou Spear. These are 2 very similar units. They are militia-like quality units in that they are expendable, but if you look at their stats, they're actually pretty good. The Qingzhou Halberd are very close to the Ji infantry. You get the same weapon damage, you get higher charge bonus. Lower morale does not hurt it because you have misplaced devotion as ability, so when your morale dips, you actually get double attack damage and unbreakable, which is what really make these units strong, and they're cheaper than the Z infantry. So the Qingzhou Halberd is actually super strong. Conversely, the Qingzhou Spear is the more defensive option. Now, because they're militia-like, they don't have access to formations. That's their main weakness. They are very cheap. You have a decent shield by default, but no formation to build off of that. Slightly weaker damage because you have the short spear, but overall, very comparable stats to the Heavy Spear Guard for much cheaper cost. But since these two units have such similar roles, the Qingzhou Halberd is actually a lot better because the Qingzhou Spears can't really function as a Spear Guard since you don't have turtle formation. So in my opinion, given the higher cost on the Qingzhou Spears, it's actually an F tier unit, while the Qingzhou Halberd are going to be A tier and can be used throughout the mid game, even into the late game if you can micro properly. They're just not going to delegate very well because of the low defensive stats, but they're glass cannon units that get unbreakable through ability, which is excellent game design in my opinion. Aside from these two units, you also have the Qingzhou Assault Infantry and the Tiger Cubs for Cao Cao in the Fates Divide DLC. Now, the Qingzhou Assault Infantry is exactly what you're looking for in a cheap, low-end melee infantry. 50% evasion with the shield, 60% range block chance on the shield, extremely high weapon damage, high charge bonus, doesn't matter if you have low morale because you have misplaced devotion, which doubles that high weapon damage, and it's super cheap, cheaper even than Dian Sword Guard. Definitely the go-to unit, worthy of A rank. Tiger Cub is an interesting place because it fails as a arrow sponge with only 45% range block chance, but it's much cheaper than Saber Cav, which is closest comp, as it has similar stats. It actually has much higher evasion, so sustained combat is much better for it, even though it has the lower charge bonus. Overall, I think it's just a C tier unit. Then finally, Yuansha also picks up a few units from the Fates Divided DLC in the Ye Vanguard Spearmen and the Ye Vanguard Crossbowmen. So the Ye Vanguard Spearmen is going to be a hybrid unit between a Heavy Spear Guard and some sort of crossbow that's not used by any other unit in the game, because there's only 160 range on these crossbow, but there is such high power damage that even outclasses the Imperial Palace Crossbowmen. As you can see, the damage breakdown is 24 base versus 56 armor piercing, and that's much higher than what you have even on the Imperial Palace crossbow. Of course, the lower range does hurt it, and there's also low ammo because it's primarily a Spear Guard unit. And speaking of the Spear Guard aspect, you have high charge on these units as the Spear Guard, and also decent melee evasion, decent armor, although the shield is a little bit weaker than the Heavy Spear Guard, but you still have 55% range block chance. You can build off of that with Spear Wall. Hollow Square is going to be very good for it, as well as you can basically wipe out any shot cavalry that approach this unit from any angle once you put it in the square. The crossbow is just going to be shorter range. And at the end of the day, I think this is just a very versatile unit for a pretty decent price, similar to the Heavy Spear Guard, and it's going to be A tier. Then the Ye Vanguard Crossbowman is also a very powerful unit. It's essentially a Chen Royal Guard for much cheaper price, and it has much better melee stats. So if you look across the board, the DLC power creep is pretty relevant. It doesn't have as much armor as a Chen Royal Guard, but it has more evasion. It has a better weapon damage considering the faster attack speed, much higher charge bonus, and it's so much cheaper that I have to rate this S tier, as essentially this is a Chen Royal Guard with more formations for 33% less cost. And finally, the last two units for Yuansha on this DLC is going to be the Liang Daring Infantry and the Xiongnu Noble Cavalry. The Liang Daring Infantry is a very interesting design in that it has a unique ability that trades off its defensive stat in terms of its high evasion for more damage. And that's a pretty interesting trade-off because just looking at the stats, it's essentially a Rapid Tiger Infantry with slightly lower weapon damage, but you're also paying about 25% less, so that's pretty decent. Higher charge bonus, and you have the same 52% evasion, which is very high. It's a little bit more fragile at 20% armor, and you trade away the defensive stats, you get increased attack that sort of match the Rapid Tiger Infantry. So I think you have more versatility with this unit in terms of how you use them. They're essentially a daring infantry, means they're ready to die, your suicide squad, and that's a very fun design, and I will get this at A tier. The Xiongnu Noble Cavalry is quite interesting in that it's one of the few heavy melee cavalry with the charge bonus to match those of the shot cavalry. If you look at the stat across the board, it's actually much closer to Imperial Household Cavalry without any of the reform requirements. Sure, you don't have the insane morale stats, but you don't really need 70 points of morale. The charge bonus is very high, close to that of a heavy Tiger and Leopard. You have the 50% missile resistance, you have the 45% shield, a very high powered sword with 24 attack speed and very high weapon damage, outclassing even those of the Imperial Household Cavalry. So overall, it's a very strong unit for half the price of the Imperial Household Cavalry. So that is actually insane value and should be rated as S tier. Now, moving back to the Yellow Turban DLC, we have a complete different set of unit being recruited by completely different generals, so we have to reset our baseline, and we start that with the Peasant unit, which is available to all three classes of Yellow Turban generals in the Yellow Turban DLC, not the Mando Heaven Yellow Turban factions. And we have the Peasant Warrior, Peasant Spearmen, Peasant Archers, and Yellow Turban Horsemen. And we'll start discussion with the Peasant Warriors and Peasant Spearmen, as they're both fodder units with the expendable trait. And if you look at their stats, they all have very high weapon damage, one with the Peasant Warrior being mostly base, 35 base, 0 armor piercing, and the Peasant Spearmen being 34 armor piercing with 8 base. They essentially have no defensive stats, very low morale. The Peasant Warrior is going to have higher charge, which means they will have a higher burst damage in the beginning and then fall off, especially against elite unit that have high armor. Whereas the Peasant Spearman is going to be better in sustained fights, better against cavalry unit, better against elite armored units. And for those reasons, I think the Peasant Warrior is a C tier unit. It's not bad. You can definitely spam Peasant unit early on, especially if you get generals with morale boosting effects, as well as evasion boosting effects. And then for Peasant Spearman, it's going to be B tier due to its higher damage and its ability to sustain itself into the mid game, as most of its damage is going to be armor piercing. Then moving on to Peasant Archers, we have a trash tier unit, basically the Archer Militia of the Yellow Turban faction, and I still wouldn't recruit these, much like the Archer Militia, even though they are so much cheaper. So these are going to be F tier for me. And then looking at the Yellow Turban Horsemen, we have sort of the Mounted Saber Militia replacement. Of course, there is no extra 20% from commander skills to boost their range protection, but they're still a decent choice for Arrow Sponge. They're just a little limited by their low charge bonus and high cost relative to the Yellow Turban roster. Of course, 220 upkeep is pretty standard for the Han faction cavalry units that we just reviewed, but of course here things are different in the Yellow Turban. So we'll see some other cavalry option later on once we look at the class unit. Here I'm just going to give this a C tier as a baseline for our cavalry comparisons going forward. Then starting with class restricted units, we start with the healer units. And there's 8 total units. We'll start by looking at the 5 melee infantry, as that's the core of the healer roster, as you want to recruit mainly these as you play healer generals. You start with the People's Warband, which is a very high damage, spammable, cheap unit that you can use in the mid game. It's similar to what you saw with the Peasant unit. Essentially, there's a class of Yellow Turban unit with very high attack power, and this is one of them with 50 base damage and 12 armor piercing at 30 attack rate. Of course, the defensive stats are going to be poor, but with a respectable morale of 34 and a very cheap cost of 160, similar to Militia tier unit for the Han, it's definitely very powerful and deserving of the B rank. Then moving on, we have the White Wave Veterans, which is going to be a more versatile defensive sword unit for the healers. They have formations such as Shield Wall, which will boost their range block chance to 95%, making them a very good frontline option. They're very cheap. They have respectable charge, respectable defensive stats, and altogether, I think they're also going to be a B tier unit. And then we have the Yosiat, which is a half unit size unit, as in there's only 60 models in the group. The health is going to reflect that a little bit, in that instead of 36k, which you expect to see, they actually have 54k health. So each unit actually has 1.5k health. So they're actually tankier. They're also unbreakable, which is their key selling point. They're excellent frontline choice with good formations, good shield that blocks range. You can go up to 90% once you're in shield wall. High evasion stat, 65% with shield. High armor, 63% with shield. And decent charge bonus, very powerful sword weapon. So they're just a very strong unit overall. It hurts a little bit that they're half unit size, but aside from that, they're top of the line and deserving of an A rank. Aside from melee infantry, the healer class also has a few spear units, starting with Yellow Turban Spearmen, which is sort of the default frontline spear option for the Yellow Turban. There is no turtle formation on these. They can just get shield wall, which in my opinion might not be that good. The White Wave Veterans might be a better choice with higher damage output, as they have much faster attack speed. There is a attack speed penalty on Yellow Turban Spearmen. Only 16 is very low. The evasion's not very high. The armor's not very high. They are going to get a little bit extra bonus damage against cavalry. They do have higher armor piercing damage, but I think they're not the best frontline option here. So they're just going to get a C tier rank. Arm of the Supreme Peace is the last melee unit for the healer class, and it's a quarter-size infantry unit, which is very bad. because you essentially lose 75% of your damage output, even though these have very high damage with their mace and their splash damage on top of that, decent charge, defensively weak against range, but good against infantry due to high morale. But I would argue they're not going to perform as good as White Wave Veterans or even People's Warband if you're looking for a high damage option, since you are only going to be fielding a quarter unit. And because of that, I think they're just F tier unit. They look good on paper, but you only get 30 of them, just way too few for their price, and thus they're not actually worth recruiting. Then wrapping up the healer unit, we have a range hybrid unit in the Bringers of Righteous. It has a glaive weapon, it has an arrow, it has access to fire arrow and poison arrow depending on if you have the right skills. But the issue with this unit is, even though it has a high charge bonus, it has the glaive damage, which is nice, defensive stat a little bit weak, but not a major problem. Essentially, it's just the archer. The health on this unit, being a predominantly blue unit, means it's restricted to 45k health, and that's just too low compared to the 72k health you get from a regular infantry, and that's going to hold it back. So honestly, this is not where you want to be recruiting your range unit in the Yellow Turban army as a healer. So this is just going to get F tier. It's not the right place for this unit. It's also very expensive, so just skip out this unit and recruit your range unit on a different general, which we'll cover very soon. What you should consider recruiting on healers, aside from getting the melee infantry, is consider getting some shot cavalry, as you have access to the Righteous Vanguards and the White Wave Horsemen. And taking a look at these two units, one thing to note is that the White Wave Horseman has the missile resistant trait, which is usually only found on melee cavalry. For Yellow Turbans, the rules are different. So it's going to be sort of the hybrid unit for Yellow Turbans, and that's very good because it picks up the shot cavalry charge of 234, extremely high charge, it's cheap, decent speed, even though you don't have much armor, but that's understandable because that's the trade-off. So between these two units, the White Wave Horseman is just going to outperform the Righteous Vanguard because you're paying for the right stats, higher charge, your missile resistance on these units, same weapon damage. Sure, there's not a lot of defensive stat, but if you just treat these as flanking unit, they're going to do great and for a much cheaper price. So I'm going to rate the White Wave Horseman A tier and then skip out on the Righteous Vanguard entirely, as I'm going to give them F tier, as I don't think they're going to do a great job as a heavy shot cavalry in the first place with such low charge, so it's not worth the price. Just go for the White Wave Horseman instead. Moving on to the Scholar class, we have 9 units, and unlike the Healer class, which focus more on frontline infantry or shot cavalry units, the Scholar class is going to focus on offensive infantry, and we're going to see that pretty much right away. Starting with Yellow Turban Warriors, which is a decent all-around choice, but it really excels in nothing. It's relatively cheap, pretty much a fodder unit. It does have access to Shield Wall, which is saving grace. But the Scholar class is not where we want frontline unit, so it's only going to get the C tier rank. The next unit in the Yellow Sky Herald is an Unbreakable Infantry. It has decent weapon damage but low defense, and it makes up for the low defense by being unbreakable, so they will fight to the every last man. It's definitely a very strong offensive unit. Anytime you have an unbreakable unit, it kind of changes the game. It's very cheap as a fodder unit. Being unbreakable has its values with 21 armor piercing damage, so it's definitely an A rank unit. I wouldn't go any higher because it does lack a lot of defensive stat, and there are a lot of higher damage unit available for the Yellow Turbans. Moving on, we have the Fallen Paragon, which is one of those units with very high damage. It does have a half unit size penalty against it, but you can see 61 damage in base, 15 armor piercing, 27 attack speed. Essentially the People's Warband with half unit size, but better defensive stat and slightly higher weapon stat as well. 40 morale means these things won't rout. Definitely a spammable unit with only 80 upkeep costs. The costs reflect the fact that it's a half unit size, which is nice, but you're still capped by how many units you can fit in an army. Of course, you have a lot of generals around. You can bring multiple armies, all spamming Fallen Paragon, and that strategy will actually work. But considering that it's half unit size, I can only give this unit a B rank. Following that, we have the Vulnerable Wolf, which is this weird half unit size poison weapon unit with very low damage. Its purpose is to grind down the enemy with its high evasion, slowly poisoning them and wiping them out. In my opinion, that's not a very good strategy. Poison is great, but it takes so much time. It's better to apply it with range. With melee weapons, you're reapplying and resetting the timer. It's not actually building up poison damage. You're just extending how long they're poisoned, so it's not as effective. They have a decent pool of health for half unit size, and they have high morale. So essentially the entire design philosophy of this unit is to kind of grind down your opponent. I don't really love this strategy. It's a pain to play this strategy. I prefer to play a little bit fast, so I'm going to punish it a little bit and only give it a C rank. Even though as a unit itself, I think it might deserve a little higher rank, but it's just not fun to play with. So I'm going to only give it a C rank, and it's also very expensive. And speaking of expensive, we have Scholar Warriors next, and it's an expensive version of the Hornwall Paragon. It has the same exact weapon. It has higher charge bonus, it has higher morale, it has higher defensive stats across the board. It's a premium version of the Hornwall Paragon, but in my opinion, you don't need a premium version of a glass cannon unit that you're setting in there to spam to charge. You're paying 4 times as much for a unit that's still half unit size, still has some of the key flaws of the Hornwall Paragon despite the improved defenses, and honestly, there's not even an improved armor stat on this. So I think this is a terrible unit upgrade. Stick with Hornwall Paragons. You can get 4 for the price of 1. Outfit yourself with 4 armies of Hornwall Paragons. It's going to do better than Scholar Warriors, and that's why it's going to be F tier. Moving on, we have the Chanters, which is only good for its ability. You get 10% melee damage boost and 10% armor boost for all nearby unit when you have a Chanter to support allies nearby. Only recruit one of them, tremendous value for their ability, absolutely trash tier unit for its own stat, but because of the 10% boost it can give to a nearby unit, but because of the stat boost it can give to its allies, it's going to be ranked as A tier. Next up, we have another half unit size Militia of Virtue. Now this is going to be an unbreakable unit. It does have improved health, as in it's 1.5 times the regular health. Once again, another one of these grinds you out unit with 60% evasion, similar to what we saw with Vulnerable Wool, except for this time, you won't break, so you can actually last longer. They're very good at holding positions. There's not much damage on them, most of it being base damage. So they're going to do quite poorly into higher tier infantry, but against the fodders, they're good at holding choke points, and that's essentially what they're used for. So for that purpose, I'm going to rank them A tier, but like the Chanters, you don't want too many of these, but a few in each army to help you hold key positions is definitely worthwhile to open up flanks for your cavalry to charge into the enemy unit, for example. They'll be perfect for that role. Moving on, we also have the Archery Master. Similar to Scholar Warriors, these are a very overpriced unit for what they are. They have the highest range for archery unit available to Yellow Turbans at 225, which is a weird number. Essentially, it's close to a crossbow range at 220. In practice, there really is no difference, as you can't really game out the 5 range advantage to shoot them while they can't hit you back. In terms of melee stat, they are pretty trash like regular archers, but they somehow have very high morale, which I guess you're paying for. The fact that you're half unit size as a range unit, and the fact that Scholars really doesn't specialize in range unit, means you should never recruit these. You want your range unit on your veteran class, so skip these. These are going to be F tier. Lastly, we have the Jadza Raiders. They're roughly half size. They're slightly more than half size, 16 units instead of 15, which should be the half size. Once again, very weird unit size, and because of it, it's very weak. Now, it does have high stats. It's a heavy melee cavalry with decent charge, which we praise for things like the Xiongnu Noble Cav, which had the similar charge bonus here. But because we're only getting 16 unit here, it's hard to give this a high rating, as you have less collisions, you have less units hitting enemies. So overall, I think this is going to be an F tier unit. You don't really want this to be your arrow sponge. You can use a regular Yellow Turban Horseman for that. And if you want to use this as your charging cavalry, the White Wave Horseman from the healer class is going to be your better go-to choice. So this is still going to be F tier for me. Then moving on to the veteran class, we have 9 units, and really what you want to recruit on veteran class are just range unit, as they have access to the siege weapons as well. It looks like there's some frontline choices here, but they're all very bad, and you should actually just get your frontline unit from the healer class. But taking a look at Fervent Defenders and Guardian of the Land together, they're basically your D infantry and heavy D infantry for the Yellow Turban, but both have lighter armors than what you expect compared to the D infantry and heavy D infantry, and they have very low morale. Not things you want to see in a unit that's ready to compromise with no shield, so both are going to be F tier. Reclaimers looks like your spear guard option for the Yellow Turban, except they don't have turtle formation. So that makes them actually very weak, and if you can only access shield wall, might as well go with a White Wave Veteran from the healer class as your frontline option. So this is also F tier. Virtuous Nobleman, similar problems with weird unit size, 70% unit size here, 21 unit out of 30. It's a heavy melee cavalry, so it's kind of good and nothing, no high charge, has 60% range block chance, but you can't boost it anymore with class bonuses. So you're better off getting a Yellow Turban Horseman that can block 65%. It's just not worth the money to invest in something with so few units, and it's going to be F tier as well. Now, the core of the veteran class are going to be these 5 range units. Starting with the Yellow Turban Archers and Men of the Forest, we have 2 basic archer unit that are pretty similar in terms of range stats. The Men of the Forest are going to be a little better with the faster firing rate, and they're going to have improved melee stats, and that's what you're paying for the extra upkeep. But honestly, both are your standard cheap archer options, not really worth recruiting, but not terrible either. And I would rank both as C tier. You don't really want the Men Forest in melee because they are still a blue unit with low health, so they're not going to match up against other infantry options there. Moving on to the Lance Chosen and the Watchmen of the Peace. Here are the range unit that you really want to consider when playing as Yellow Turban. The Lance Chosen is your go-to archery option. They have the Archery Master Bow, so same 225 range, same damage composition, 38 base, 5 armor piercing, high ammo count, exactly what you want in a normal unit size for almost half the price. So they're infinitely better than Archery Masters, and why Archery Masters should be F tier. These I'm going to rate as A tier. Watchman of the Peace is going to be your go-to choice, in my opinion, because of the armor piercing focus of the crossbow. They're essentially the crossbow unit for Yellow Turbans. They have a shield on them, so that will help protect them from enemy range, so they're good at trading fire as well. In terms of melee stat, they're decent, but you really don't want to be throwing your range unit into melee if you don't have to. Overall, another unit I would rate as A. So Lance Chosen, the Watchman of the Peace, these are your go-to choices. Last but not least, we have the Horseback Huntsman, which is a cheap mounted archer unit for the Yellow Turban. It's a terrible cavalry unit, so we don't even need to consider it as a cavalry unit. It has the same melee damage as what you expect from a cheap archer with almost no charge bonus, even though they're on horseback. They are very cheaply priced, and you do get a good bow on them on the horse. They have the same damage as E-Archers, which is pretty good, but once again, quarter unit size. But they are cheap. A few of them to kind of pull the enemy army apart is something you can consider. So I wouldn't give them an F tier, I would just give them a C tier. At least they're fairly priced for what they're bringing, and the bow damage is quite high actually. It's higher than Lance Chosen if you look at the stats. So I think C tier is pretty fair. Now, aside from the Yellow Turban DLC, for the Mandate of Heaven, there were more Yellow Turban units introduced for those 3 John Brother playable factions, and we'll also take a look at them, starting with the Peasant Volunteer. Very similar to the Peasant Warrior. I don't know why they decided to recreate the unit again. There's slightly more morale in these for slightly increased costs. I would still rate these as C tier, no different from Peasant Warriors in my opinion. Then we have the Spearman Gang, which is actually a solid frontline choice for Yellow Turbans, as this is pretty much your spear guard with turtle formation. Very low damage, as the damage composition is very weird, with 30 base damage and 2 armor piercing somehow for spear, which typically should have more armor piercing damage. But this is what we get, and it's fine because you have turtle formation, so this is a B tier unit for a pretty cheap cost. And then for Poacher and Archer Gang, these are available for all classes of generals for Yellow Turbans from the Mandate of Heaven. And Poachers are going to be a pretty disappointing unit because they're put up directly against the Archer Gang, which is not very good either. Archer Gangs are pretty much your standard archer, and I will give them a C rank. Poachers, on the other hand, because it has way less ammo than the Archer Gang, it gains guerrilla deployment, but that's not really important. So I think they are F tier unit in my opinion. And then in addition to these 4 units, there's also 3 additional units available to all classes in the Saber Defector, Redeem Outlaws, and the Z Defectors. Now the Saber Defectors are pretty much Saber Militia unit converted into a defecting Yellow Turban unit. It's not very good, especially if you compare it with the Redeem Outlaw, which we'll do next, so it's going to be an F tier unit. Redeem Outlaws are slightly more expensive than Saber Defectors, but you have access to formations, especially Shield Wall, which is excellent and crucial here. Stat-wise, it's not that different from Saber Defector, with the key strength being a better weapon and higher morale, but it's going to have a little bit less melee evasion and a little bit less charge bonus to kind of hold it back. But with formations, is totally transformed unit, and I would rate this unit C tier. It's not a great unit, but it's definitely better than Saber Defectors. Similarly, Z Defectors are pretty much your Z Militia converted to a Yellow Turban unit. It's bad, just like Z Militias, and it's just a terrible unit all around, and thus is an F tier unit. Moving on to class restricted unit for Mandate of Heaven, and once again we start with the healer class, as there are 3 units in Bringers of Peace, Mounted Lancer Defectors, and Stort Shields. Now the Bringers of Peace is an unbreakable quarter unit size axe unit. So these guys are super tanky, having 3 times the expected health of an infantry unit, and they have high damage. Their best use is to apply the axe debuff. They're unbreakable, will fight to the death. Very annoying to play against because they're hard to remove, even though damage-wise, they're going to be lacking a bit because they're a quarter unit size. Still a very fun unit to use and still very strong, so I'm going to give it A tier. If it had half unit size with the same health ratio or has a regular unit size, it would definitely be a S tier unit, but it doesn't, so it's A tier. The Mounted Lancer Defectors are going to be sort of your Mounted Lancer Militia alternate, and for Yellow Turbans that really lack cavalry option, this is a very nice speedy option to have, 95 speed. You have very decent charge, over 200. So I'm actually going to give this an A tier rank because of the lack of cavalry options for Yellow Turbans, and this sort of becomes the go-to option for the Mandate of Heaven Yellow Turban forces. And then finally we have the Stort Shield, which is going to be your heavy spear guard option. Unlike the heavy spear guard, it has a default 80% range block chance, it has higher unit health, it has very good morale, and overall just a very strong unit. And for Yellow Turbans that really lack frontline options, especially those with turtle formation, I'm going to give this unit S tier just because it stands out so much along Yellow Turban unit, and the cost is not that high at 215. Now switching over to the Scholar class, we have 2 units in the Mounted Saber Defectors and Aesthetics of the Way. Mounted Saber Defectors are going to be your Mounted Saber Militias changed over to Yellow Turbans. It's decent, not as high charge, definitely very fast, good at absorbing enemy arrow damage. But in terms of class specialization, Scholar class should be featuring high hitting infantry options. So I think there's a bit too much competition here for this unit, and for that reason, I think it's going to be C tier. Might as well go with the Mounted Lancer Defectors from the Healer class instead of going for another cavalry option in the Scholar class. Aesthetic of the Way is basically your Militia Virtue clone, but it doesn't have Unbreakable, which kind of ruins the purpose of the unit, as well you have very high evasion. Here you have only 30 points of morale, so you get routed very quickly, you have almost no damage with most of your damage being base, and you have almost no armor and absolutely no ranged defense, so Aesthetic of the Way is going to be F tier. Then moving on to the Veteran class, which typically features your range unit, we have a new addition in the Archer Defectors, but this is really just the Archer gain with even less health, and that's actually terrible. So this is actually F tier. Exemplars of the Dalt is the last class restricted unit, and it's a very strong unit. It has very high stats across the board, whether it's morale, whether it's health, whether it's charge bonus, high damage, high attack speed, high evasion, high armor, decent formations with 55% range block chance, and it's not that expensive at 225. It's just the all-around very strong unit option here for Veteran class. The only thing that's going to hold back its rank a little bit is that you might want to focus on range unit on your Veteran class, but this is definitely a new option added during Mandate of Heaven, and worthy of being ranked as A tier here. Aside from these new additions, Mandate of Heaven DLC also had faction unique unit added for Zhangjiao, Zhangbao, and Zhangliang. And starting with Zhangjiao's faction, we have Chosen of the 8 Immortals and Messenger of Heaven. So Chosen of the 8 Immortals is very similar to Exemplars of the Dalt that we just saw. It's a unit with very high stats across the board, very good melee infantry unit. But unlike Exemplar of the Dalt, it's half unit size and has no shield. Even though it is very cheap for half unit size, it's great at everything else. Overall, I think it balanced out to a B rank. Then for Messenger of Heaven, we have a unit that's double unit size for General Cavalry, and it has very high health, even with double unit size. It has insanely high morale, decent charge bonus for melee cav, missile resistance, which is expected on a melee cavalry. There's no shield, but you still get 20% range block chance. You have a very good sword weapon. It's dual sword, so very high damage, very fast speed at 95. There's no weakness on this unit. It's absolutely insane. You get a double unit size cavalry. More collisions when you run to infantry. You outgun other cavalry unit when trading directly with them. Even though your charge bonus might not be as high, your weapon damage is definitely better, and you have twice the amount of unit to hit them. So this is definitely S tier unit. This unit is straight up broken. You can recruit it on everyone, and you should recruit it on everyone, as this unit definitely breaks the game with double unit size on a cavalry option. Then moving on to Zhangbao, we have Zealots of the Way and Yaoguai Hunters. So Zealots of the Way have a unique ability that trades its armor for increased evasion. At the highest level, you lose all your armor, but you get up to 88% max evasion, which is straight up insane. Decent weapon damage, decent charge bonus, slightly weaker in terms of morale, but aside from that, a decent unit all around, as you even get a little bit of range block chance from being agile, and for that, I'm going to give it a B rank. And then we have the Yaoguai Hunters, which is pretty much your poison archer with snipe and stock. It's strong because you can whittle down enemies with poison. It takes a lot of time, 15 seconds per volley on every unit to reapply the poison effect. You can win games this way, but the battles will be very drawn out and very boring. It's not a very fun way to play the game, so for that reason, I'm not going to give it S tier. It's just going to be an A tier for me. And closing things out with Zhangnao, we have Gallants of the People and Tyrant Slayer. So Gallants of the People is your heavy spear guard, but it doesn't have turtle formation. However, it is very cheap. It has very good all-around stats, and it has Encourage. So for those reasons, I think it's still worthy of a B rank. Tyrant Slayers, on the other hand, is a very interesting unit in that it gets up to 4 times damage against enemy heroes. It also has a very high charge bonus of 292, decent speed for medium cavalry, and given how Yellow Turban generals have such class restrictions on shot cavalry where you pretty much only can recruit them on scholars, it's actually very nice to have one as your faction unique unit. And for that reason, I think Tyrant Slayers are worthy of S rank. They're also very good whether you're playing romance mode or record mode, even though for most of this tier list, I'm using romance mode as the frame of reference. Even though I don't think there's too much difference with how units interact. Very few units have specialties against generals like this. For romance mode, sometimes the generals might have a splash ability and you don't want to run your Tyrant Slayers at them, even though you do have this nice 4 times damage against them. Now, as we wrap up all the Yellow Turban units, we move on to the Bandits. And starting things off, we have the Bandit Warriors. Now, the Axeband unit next to it is not a comparison unit, but rather a unit that the Bandit Sentinels can recruit. So it's technically a unit competing with the Bandit Warriors for this slot. And because of this competition, it's pretty clear the Bandit Warrior is just not very good. It's a glass cannon unit compared to the Axeband. It has lower charge, even though it does have higher damage, but a slower attack speed. Overall, it's just not as good, and it's going to be F tier. Then for the Bandit Gains, competing with the Peasant Band, which makes it a pretty decent frontline option as you have shield. There are just not many Bandit units available, aside from the ones you get from the Reform tree. So technically this is going to be your best frontline option for the 3 Bandit factions, and it's going to give this a C tier. Then moving on to the blue unit, we have the Bandit Hunters, which is competing with the Crossbowmen, and it's not a fair competition as the Crossbowmen is just so much better in terms of range, in terms of damage, being armor piercing damage as well, and you should always go with the Crossbowman who's also cheaper, and therefore Bandit Hunter is just going to be F tier. And finally, we have 2 cavalry options in the Bandit Marauders and the Bandit Raiders, and they're both competing with the Peasant Raiders. Now, typically, the melee cavalry is supposed to be the one tanking arrows. They do have missile resistance, but they're just not going to be effective as an arrow sponge. And looking at their low charge bonus of less than 100 points, they're just not worth recruiting. You're much better off sticking with the Bandit Raiders, which has a decent charge bonus of 169 in comparison to the other 2 choices. It's not great, but considering that bandits don't have good cavalry units by default, this is the best option, and therefore the Bandit Marauders will get an F rank. And the Bandit Raiders will get an A rank for their high speed, decent charge, and good weapon damage, as well as a decent morale on top of that. Now, aside from generic Bandit unit, there's also faction unique units, starting with Zhang Yan's faction, which features a lot of ambush battles due to their faction mechanic, and 2 of the best units to do that is going to be their Black Mountain Marauders and Black Mountain Outlaws, which are both charge heavy infantry unit, one with dual axe, one with a spear. Both have high damage and are big glass cannon, but that's fine, as you'll be starting every battle charging into the enemy lines right away, given that they're mostly ambush battles, and thus you don't really need any range block chance. And both of these units are going to be worthy of 8 rank in my book, with the Black Mountain Marauder better at killing enemy shielded infantry, while the Black Mountain Outlaws are better at killing enemy cavalry. Both will cause scare, definitely what you want with Zhang Yan's faction. Lastly, we have the Black Mountain Hunters. Now this is primarily a range unit, so you can get fire arrows and poison arrows, which are great, But given that Giants faction focus on charging, Black Mountain Hunters do have high charge bonus, but because they're primarily a blue unit, their total health is only 40k, which makes them rather weak in melee combat. You're not really going to be hiding in the forest to shoot your arrows at the beginning of ambush battles, and they only have the regular archer damage, so it's not very good, and this is going to be just C tier. Then moving on to Zheng Jiang's faction unique unit, we have the Hidden Axes and the Fists of the Bandit Queen, and this is the story of two extremes. Hidden Axes and Fist of the Bandit Queen look very similar, both with the same weapon, both having a ranged bow, but they can't be any more different, as Hidden Axes have stock and snipe, making them the solid all-around unit with decent charge, decent weapon damage, options to use poison arrows, use fire arrows to shoot while hidden, whereas the Fist of the Bandit Queen does not have snipe or stock, so they're basically a glass cannon overpriced unit on the field that can get picked off by enemy forces, even with improved defensive stat that you're paying for a slight increase in upkeep cost. They're still not very tanky, so because of this, you should always just stick with Hidden Axes. The stock capability helps their range to close the gap against enemy range, as you don't have any range block chance. You can sneak to take settlements. You can use the snipe to use poison arrows to wipe out the enemy, even though you only have 5 ammo. But even with 5 ammo, with poison arrows, take your time. About a minute into it, the enemy will be half health, and then you charge in, cause scare, and win the game. So because of this extreme, Hidden Axes are actually a S tier unit, because the combination of stock and snipe, plus a solid melee infantry on top of that. Then for the Fist of Bandit Queen, it's going to be F tier, because you should stay away from this unit. Always go with Hidden Axes. They lost snipe and stock, and it makes it completely a different unit. And lastly, we have Yanbaihu's faction unique unit, which includes the White Tiger Warriors, the Ye Remnant Warriors, Yue Tribesmen, and White Tiger Raiders. And starting with the White Tiger Warriors, we have an inexpensive axe unit that is very glass cannon. It has very high damage, including very high armor piercing damage, a little bit slow attack speed, but it has decent charge. And as Yanbaihu, you can give these units stock, which makes them even more powerful. And even if they don't have stock, for their price, they're very good fodder units to throw in there and wipe out enemy infantry. So for that reason, I'm going to rank it as A. The Yue Remnant Warrior looks like a glass cannon yellow turban unit with very high base damage of 50 and 12 armor piercing, but actually it's not glass cannon. It has a very decent armor on it at 45%, slight evasion 22%, decent morale, solid charge bonus, just a great unit overall. And if you can give it stock as Yanbaihu's faction, it's even better. So this is also going to be an A tier unit. And then we have the Yue Tribesmen, which honestly is a more defensive peasant band, or pretty much a spear warrior. It's not a terrible unit by itself in isolation, but looking at the options that's competing against the other faction unique unit, I don't think there's a role for this unit, so it's going to be F tier in my book. And then lastly, we have the White Tiger Raider, which is not only a bow unit, but also a spear unit. So for its range stats, it's pretty much like an archer, except it has stock and snipe. And it has access to poison arrows, which are readily available on bandit generals. And you have access to formations such as Spear Wall to highlight your spear aspect, as this is pretty much a spear guard unit without turtle formation. You have the heavy spear guard weapon and 60% shield of the regular spear guard. Overall, it's a very strong hybrid unit. Of course, this is primarily a blue unit, so it's not going to do that well in melee. But you have the capability of hiding them on the open field in spear wall formation and tricking the enemy cavalry to run into them. The charge reflect would do its job. So overall, it's a very strong unit because of the combination with stock and snipe, poison arrows on top of that, and still a pretty decent unit even if you don't rely on the poison arrow aspect. So for those reasons, I think this is a S tier unit that can win you games in a multitude of ways. And finally, we come to the Nanman unit, which is going to be our final portion of the tier list here, as they're introduced in the Furious Wild DLC. And kicking things off, we have the Nanman Warriors, the Nanman Spearmen, and the Nanman Slingers. Now, the Nanman Warrior is a very decent all-around choice that's very cheap for the Nanman faction. They're using Axe, so there is the Axe debuff. Now, most Nanman units are going to be weak against fire, and these are included as well. They're pretty much your saber infantry option for the Nanman faction. No formations, but that's pretty standard for these lower tier unit, so it's going to get a C rank here. Then up next, we have the Nanman Spearmen, which is just a terrible unit all around. Low morale, low damage, does have high charge bonus, but doesn't really match those of the Nanman Warriors. You don't have a shield. You do use a polearm weapon, but you only have 2 points of armor piercing. There's not many cavalry units for you to fight as a Nanman faction, So the use of spear units overall loses a lot of its value. And all things considered, this is a F tier unit. And lastly, we have the Nanman Slingers, which is also F tier just for the fact it's a slinger. Slingers in the game have very low range of only 100. They have high ammo count. They do apply suppression. But what typically happens is they will fire into friendly unit and the friendly unit will get suppressed as well. So it's a double-edged sword. Their damage is pretty much on the low end, same as a regular archer, but they are shorter range by at least half. And they're also absolutely terrible in melee. So all things considered, they're also going to be F tier. And essentially every slinger unit is going to be F tier in my book. Moving on, we have a few more purple infantry, starting with the Ravine Warriors. These are going to be your fodder unit. The issue with them is that it's better off to go with the Nanman Warriors. You get a shield, you get better damage composition. These have essentially no armor piercing damage despite holding an axe that will debuff the enemy shield. But overall, you will be much better off just going with Nanman Warriors. You're paying a bit more extra, but you're getting more than enough back. So that makes this a F tier unit. Then for the Valley Tribesmen, we have a huge improvement over the Nanman Warriors. The weapon is weaker and you're not using an axe. Most of your damage is still base, but the key thing here is you have access to formations finally. So this becomes the first viable frontline option for the Nanman faction. You have a good spear wall option that can block a lot of the range. So this is going to end up as a B tier unit. Then moving on, we have the Might of the Valley. This is a very powerful unit. It has a special trait where once you drop below 50% health, you gain a 33% attack rate boost as well as a 15% melee damage boost. And its damage is already very strong. The attack speed is one of its weaknesses, so getting that increase, boosting your damage even farther, having insane charge that match those of high tier shot cavalry. This is definitely the go-to unit as the offensive powerhouse of the Nanman faction. And for that, it's going to get the S rank. And finally, we have two axe throwers, the regular axe throwers and the Wugwa axe throwers. Now, these two units are pretty similar. The regular axe thrower is essentially your Valley Tribesman with a high damage throwing axe as an option. There is only 2 ammo with a throwing axe and the range is only 50, but the damage is insanely high as you can see. 75 armor piercing damage, 25 base damage. This is going to hurt and that's going to give it a lot of value. The Wugwa axe thrower on the other hand has dual weapon, but it has weaker attack because it has the same attack damage but slower attack speed. It has less charge bonus, slight improvement in defensive stat, but you actually don't have access to shield. You don't have access to formations. Same exact throwing axe unit. So overall, it's a worse version of the regular axe throwers. You should always recruit the regular axe throwers over the Wugwa axe throwers. And therefore, the Wugwa axe thrower is going to be F tier, while the axe throwers are going to be A tier. And then moving on to some regional troops, we have the Wuling Fighters and the Wuling Slingers, along with the Shields of the South, Nundrong Champions, and Nundrong Spearmen. The Wuling Fighters have a unique ability that gives it 4 times damage against generals, but it's an infantry unit, so it's going to have a hard time catching generals, and on top of that, most of its damage is base damage, so even with the increased damage, it's not going to be very effective against general with high armor count. But otherwise, compared to other Nanman infantry, the stat is okay, you get access to formations, so it's not a terrible unit and can be rated as B tier. Then for Wuling Slingers, my opinion on Slingers have not changed. They have the same range, a little bit more ammo. There's really nothing special about it, and it's going to be still F tier. Up next, we have Shield of the South, which has turtle formation. That's one of the things going for it, even though spears typically have low damage here for the Nanman unit, most of it being base damage. It also has Encourage, but it's a very expensive unit, and spear units typically have less value for Nanman unit, as there's not many cavalry for you to fight, at least in the early game, when you're dealing with mostly other Nanman tribes. So it's not a very strong unit, but given that it has formations, I think it's worthy of B tier. Following that up, we have Nundrong Champion, which is an axe unit. It does have a shield, and it has turtle. This is very strong combination, as you're very good against other infantry units, especially those with shield, and you have the formation to protect you from enemy range, and a shield wall on top of that to protect you from enemy cavalry as well. It's also relatively cheaper, especially compared to the Shields of the South we just talked about. So this unit is actually going to get an A tier rank. And finally, we have the Nundrong Spearman, which is going to be sort of your shieldless spear unit. It has slightly more damage, but most of it still being base damage. Charge bonus does not stand out because most infantry for Nanman factions have high charge. So there's not much going for this unit. Defensive stats also weak, no range block chance. It has the spear wall formation, but without shield, it's not really worth very much. So overall, this is going to be an F tier unit. Now, moving on, we have 4 more Nanman units here, and all of them have a secondary javelin or primary javelin, and those javelin damage are quite high, so we're going to group these together and talk about them. Starting with the wolf pack, this is sort of a cavalry replacement because there's a special ability here that will greatly boost the speed and charge speed of this unit as well as charge bonus by 50% each. And that really carries the wolf pack as long as you have multiple copies of this unit together in each other's range to activate this ability. So essentially, this is sort of your cavalry replacement option for a Nanman unit. The damage on these are pretty average for a Nanman unit, nothing super special here, but it's not low. You still have 39 base damage, given that most Nanman units don't have that high of armor. This is going to be perfectly fine. The javelins are the specialty of these 4 featured unit here, and you have 3 ammo, 60 range, 50 armor piercing damage, 20 base damage. It's not as strong as the throwing axe, but you get a little bit more range and you get a little bit more ammo and still decently high damage, and definitely should be utilized here. So all things considered, I think the Wolfpack should be an A tier unit. Moving on, we have the Javelin Spearman, and this is pretty much a weaker version of the Wolfpack. It is slightly cheaper, but without its special ability, it's just not going to match in damage. Attack speed is a little bit slower, morale's a little bit lower. You do have higher charge bonus initially, but once you take in the factor of the Wolfpack bonus, it's actually going to have less. It's not going to match the speed, same exact Javelin stat. So given the option, you should always be spamming Wolfpacks, therefore the Javelin Spearman is going to get an F rank. Moving on, we have a similar unit in the Javelin Spear Guard, except this unit gets a shield, therefore it has access to formations like Shield Wall and Turtle, which gives very high value. The great thing about the turtle formation is you can shoot your javelins well in turtle, so you can be protected from enemy range and march this unit up to enemy units or enemy generals, throw the javelin at close range, and deal massive damage while you're clustered together, as your javelins will be quite accurate at that time. In terms of weapon damage, it has the same weapon as the Wolfpack, it has higher base charge. So this is overall a very strong unit, definitely the go-to frontline choices for Nanman factions. The only weakness here is you only have 2 ammo for your javelin, but given that you have access to turtle formation, the trade-off is understandable, as I still rate this unit as S tier amongst the choices for the Nanman faction. Lastly, we have the Javelin Thrower. This is going to be primarily a blue unit, so the health is going to be lower. You get more ammo, but unfortunately for javelins, more ammo means 6. And that means 3 additional ammo compared to the Javelin Spearman and the Wolfpack. It's not really worth it in my opinion because you end up with a unit with terrible melee stats, so overall I think this is going to be an F tier unit. Moving on, we have a few more Nanman unit featuring fire weapons and poison weapons, starting with the Followers of the Flame. Now this is a smaller unit size, 75% unit size, it has high damage, you have a flaming mace that will deal fire debuff, and fire damage have extra bonus against most Nanman unit that has double fire damage effect on themselves, as well as applying a melee evasion debuff, 50% melee evasion debuff on enemies hit by their weapon. The weapon's mostly base damage, but you get the burn tick on top of that. They're pretty glass cannon, but all things considered, given how effective fire weapons are, they also apply a morale debuff, so they're going to be an S tier unit despite the smaller unit size and despite the glass cannon nature of these units. Up next, we have Fire Archers, who shoots fire arrows by default and cannot switch back to regular arrows, and that's totally fine for Nanman factions. Even though fire arrows have less damage, most of your damage is going to be applied by the fire portion, and against Nanman unit, that is actually great. Given that there's no other long-range unit option for the Nanman faction, the Fire Archers become an S tier unit almost by default, as well as the effectiveness of fire against Nanman troops, so this is definitely the top of the line range unit option for Nanman factions and should be an S tier. Then moving on to Poison Unit, we start with the Sundown Poison Spear. This is going to be a Poison Spear Infantry. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of melee poison weapons as mentioned before. It just takes too long to tick on the poison damage and the unit's not very tanky. So there's not a lot of sustained survivability as you try to repeatedly apply your poison effect. So overall, it's just not going to be a very effective unit and therefore should be ranked as F. The Sundown Poison Dart is the range variation of this, as you have a Poison Dart that has 60 range, 30 ammo. The problem here with this unit is that you have stock, so you can move up close to a unit to shoot your dart, but you don't have snipe. So the moment you fire, the enemy is going to realize where you are and they're going to charge up to you, given the small range gap, so you can't repeatedly apply your poison damage. And given their short range, they're not effective during siege battles, so unlike some of the Poison Archer unit we mentioned in the Bandit factions or the Yellow Turban factions, which we rated quite highly, here this poison effect, even though it's on a range unit at 60 range, that's basically no range at all, as this will also get an F tier rank, and Hidden Vipers are pretty similar, It's overpriced, it has stock but no snipe. You're paying more for this unit for some defensive stats. That's not really going to matter, as even with 72k health, which matches most other infantry unit, it just doesn't have the damage to justify its design. Overall, I just think there are better options out there for the Nanman faction, and the poison unit are all going to be rated as F tier. Now lastly, we're going to close our tier list with the animal unit, starting with the Tiger Warrior and Tiger Slingers. These two are both going to be quarter unit size with 30 tigers each, and they're going to be unbreakable. The tiger gets released. You can't control the actual tigers. They charge into the enemy. They're quite fragile. They'll deal some charge bonus damage, and then they will do some melee before getting killed. Then you end up with these very weak unit, the Tiger Warriors, the trainers, have 38 base damage, 9 armor piercing, some defensive stat, being unbreakable helps, but you're still quarter unit size, so you're quite weak. Slingers are terrible to begin with, but the fact that both of these units are unbreakable and the tigers are fun to play with, even though the huge nerf to their charge bonus definitely makes them quite useless. I would say, given their price, both should just be a most C tier, if not F, but let's be kind, tigers are pretty cool. Let's rank them as C. Then for the 3 elephants, they're going to be straight up S tier, and in terms of strength, the war elephants are the strongest. They have so much more health compared to the other 2 elephants. They have the most charge at 460, heavy damage, just use them to knock down the enemy. 12 units of them is more than enough. The non-dual elephants probably the second strongest because you get 3 different boosts on them. And then the southern elephants are the weakest, but even the weakest amongst the 3 elephants are still super strong. These all have unit recruitment restrictions unless you build the right buildings, so it takes a slow build up, but even one of these units can turn the campaign around. They're just super good into infantry, and there's not much you can do about them if you use them correctly. So all 3 will be S tier here. And that will do it for us. 208 units all ranked here in this massive tier list. Now, of course, all of these are based on my opinion from playing the game. And if you happen to disagree with any of the rankings, feel free to drop a comment below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!